It was October 1998, the year I thought moving away from people would fix my head. I was 32, single, and tired of the constant hum of city noise in Spokane. My apartment sat between an all-night diner and a laundromat that rattled like a freight train when all the machines were running. I worked as a delivery driver for a warehouse supply company. Long hours, empty roads, too much time to think. By the time I saw the rental ad in the classifieds, cabin, isolated, wood stove, well water, available immediately, I had convinced myself that what I needed wasn't therapy or friends but distance, space, silence. I called the number. The landlord, a man named Rick, barely asked any questions. $600 a month. Pay first and last, you keep the woodpile stocked yourself, he said. It's about 20 miles outside Kettle Falls, down an old logging road. No neighbors except wildlife. Perfect. I drove out the next Saturday in my rusty 85 F-150, following his crew directions. Route 395 to a gravel county road, then a winding dirt path over a ridge, past an abandoned sawmill, and finally into the Cutbank Woods. The cabin sat back from the overgrown track, surrounded by pine and fir so dense the sunlight broke into sharp strips on the ground. From the front porch, you couldn't see the road, just trees, a weathered propane tank, and the jagged peaks of the Selkirks in the distance. It was small, single-story, built from thick logs gone dark with age. The windows were old, wavy glass in-wood frames. Inside, the place smelled like dry pine and cold ash. There was one bedroom, a little kitchen with a propane stove, a table scarred with knife marks, and a wood stove squatting in the corner like an iron animal. No phone line, no cell reception. The only connection to the outside world was the truck, and the road was the kind you didn't want to drive at night if it was raining or snowing. I signed the lease on the spot. Week 1. The first nights were everything I thought I wanted. Black silence so thick it felt like a blanket. No streetlights. No muffled thump of bass from some kid's stereo next door. The only sounds were the occasional crack of branches in the wind and the slow tick of the wood stove cooling after I banked the fire. I fell into a rhythm fast. Wake before sunrise, haul water from the well out back, split some wood, make coffee, and then sit on the porch watching the trees. My only trips into town were for groceries and fuel. It was on the 4th night that I first noticed the quiet wasn't as total as I'd thought. I'd been in bed, the fire dying down to embers, when I heard it. A faint crunch in the snowless leaves outside. Not steady like a deer browsing, more like 1, 2, 3 steps, then stillness. Then again crunch, crunch, pause. I lay there, not breathing. The nearest neighbor was at least 2 miles away, and there was nothing out there but dark. I told myself it was probably an elk. But elk don't stop and start like that. Week 2. The noises didn't happen every night, but often enough that I started paying attention. Sometimes it was a scuff, sometimes a sharp snap of a twig. Always between midnight and 2. Always close to the cabin, too close to be from the road. I tried looking with a flashlight one night, stepping barefoot onto the cold porch boards, but the beam just lit up drifting mist between the trees. Whatever made the noise didn't move, didn't bolt like a deer would. That's when I started locking the cabin door, even in daylight. One morning, I found something that made me uneasy. A shallow print in the soft ground near the side window. Not a boot, not a hoof. It looked like the ball of a bare foot, but distorted somehow, as if whoever left it had been carrying something heavy and the toes didn't press clearly. I couldn't match it to anything I knew. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a trick of the dirt. But after that, I started noticing other things. A low branch bent like something had pulled on it. A strip of bark scraped away on the porch railing. Week 3. By the 3rd week, I'd stopped sleeping straight through the night. I'd wake around 1 or 2, heart already beating hard, and just lie there listening. The steps weren't every night anymore. Some nights it was worse, like something brushing lightly along the wall. The cabin's logs creaked with the cold, but this was different. One morning I came out and found the lid to the well pump house lying on the ground. The nails holding the hinges were bent, not pulled clean like an animal would. The nearest sheriff's office was in Colville, nearly an hour away. I thought about driving there, but what would I say? I'm hearing noises in the woods, and my well lid fell off? They'd just nod and write it down and maybe send a deputy who wouldn't find a thing. So I started keeping my axe inside. I leaned it right by the bed. Week 4. The real change came the night of the storm. The wind had been blowing hard since afternoon, rattling the stovepipe. By evening, it was coming down in sheets, rain hitting the roof so loud it drowned out everything else. I thought maybe I'd finally get some sleep without listening for things outside. At around 1, the power flickered. Just the propane light and my little battery lantern kept the place lit. I was lying there, half asleep, when I realized something had changed. The wind had dropped. The rain still hissed against the logs, but there was no movement in the trees. Then, clear as anything, I heard the crunch of wet leaves right outside the bedroom wall. Not on the porch, on the ground, circling. Slow. My mouth went dry. I sat up, every nerve tight. The steps moved toward the front door, then stopped. I could hear water dripping from whatever it was. After maybe 30 seconds, there came a faint sound. A short, hard exhale, like someone catching their breath after a run. I stayed frozen, gripping the axe until the steps moved away, melting into the rain. Week 5. That's when I started finding things. The first was a crushed soda can on the porch. I hadn't bought any soda. Then, a week later, a piece of orange nylon rope knotted into a loop, left by the woodpile. The knot was too clean to be random. I'd take these things far into the woods and drop them, but within a few days something new would appear. Once it was a single leather glove soaked through. Another time, a strip of duct tape stuck to the outer wall. It felt less like an animal and more like someone was reminding me they'd been here. Week 6. Sleep was harder now. I kept the lantern lit all night. I stopped going into town unless I absolutely had to. It was early morning when I finally saw something. I'd been chopping wood, breath hanging in the cold air, when movement caught my eye at the tree line. A shape, tall, still, half hidden between 2 pines. I froze, axe in hand. The shape didn't move. I told myself it was a shadow, but then it shifted just slightly, and I saw pale skin like a face peeking from behind the trunk. When I stepped toward it, it slipped back into the woods without a sound. The last night, it was early November, first rail snow falling, when things broke. I'd been stacking wood by lantern light when I heard it. A sharp thud against the side of the cabin. I ran inside, slammed the door, and grabbed the axe. My breath was fogging in the cold air when another thud came, this time against the back wall. I moved to the bedroom, heart hammering, listening. Then came a long, slow drag sound along the wall, circling toward the front. The doorknob rattled. Not hard, not a frantic twist, just a slow turn back and forth. Testing. I stepped back, holding the axe up, my whole body shaking. The knob stopped. Silence. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, ears straining. Then I heard it. Footsteps, crunching away into the snow. Leaving. I left at first light. I didn't pack much, just clothes, my truck keys, and the little cash I had. I drove straight to Rick's in Kettle Falls, dropped the cabin key in his mailbox, and didn't stop until I was back in Spokane. I never saw the cabin again. I didn't call the sheriff. I didn't tell anyone. It's been years now, and I still don't know who or what kind of person spent those nights in the woods, circling my walls. What I do know is this: they wanted me to know they were there. Not to hurt me, not yet. Just to remind me that the silence I thought I wanted was never mine alone. And I'll never live that far from another human being again. The cabin sat at the end of a long dirt track, barely visible from the main road. The real estate listing had called it private and perfect for solitude. But standing there on the first afternoon, with my car engine cooling in the crisp October air, the word isolated felt more honest. It wasn't abandoned, not exactly, but it had the look of something that had been left alone too long. The boards on the porch were warped, the roof sagged a little in the middle, and the windows were dusty enough to blur whatever was inside. A stack of firewood leaned against the side wall, though the pieces on top were gray and damp from years of rain. I remember stepping out of the car and hearing nothing. Not just quiet, nothing. No wind in the trees, no birds, no distant hum of traffic. I had grown up in cities, so the silence was heavy, like it pressed in on my ears. I unlocked the cabin door. The key turned with a gritty, reluctant click, and the hinges gave a long, tired groan. The smell inside hit me first, musty, with a trace of something sweet, like old apples left in a pantry. The living room was small, just a sagging couch, a coffee table scarred with water rings, and a black iron stove in the corner. Dust lay on everything in a fine, even layer. It was the kind of dust that takes months to settle, maybe years. I spent the first hour unloading my bags, checking each room. There were only 3. The living room that fed into a kitchen with a single narrow counter, and a bedroom with a thin mattress on a wooden frame. The bathroom was an outhouse about 20 yards behind the cabin. That was one detail I'd managed to ignore in the listing. By the time the sun dipped low, I had a small fire going in the stove. It didn't throw much heat, and the air still felt damp in my lungs. I made a cup of coffee on the propane burner in the kitchen and sat on the couch, staring at the window. Outside, the light was fading fast, and the trees were turning into black silhouettes. I told myself the first night would be the hardest. The quiet, the lack of familiar city noise, it would feel strange at first, but I'd adjust. I wanted to believe that. When I finally lay down, the mattress springs groaned under my weight. The air felt colder in the bedroom, like the walls leaked warmth. I pulled the blanket tight around me. My eyes adjusted to the dark, but there was nothing to see. Just the faint outline of the door and a square of gray where the window was. I didn't hear anything unusual that first night, but the absence of sound kept waking me. I'd jolt awake thinking I'd heard something, only to realize it was just the snap of the fire or the creak of wood settling. The next morning, I made coffee and stepped outside. The cold air cut right through me, sharper than it had been the day before. The yard around the cabin was small, just a patch of dirt and weeds before the forest closed in. The trees stood close together, their trunks dark and damp. That's when I noticed something strange. A path. It wasn't obvious from the porch, but if you stepped off to the right side of the cabin, past the edge of the stacked firewood, there was a narrow strip where the ground was more worn, the weeds trampled down. It wound between the trees and vanished into the shade. I stood there for a while, coffee warming my hands, staring at it. Could have been an animal trail, I told myself, but it looked deliberate. The ground wasn't just disturbed, it was clear. I didn't go down it that day. I spent the daylight hours cleaning the cabin instead. The dust was thicker than I'd realized, and every surface felt slightly sticky. The stove flue was choked with ash, which might explain why the fire hadn't given off much heat. By the time I finished, my hands were black with soot and my throat felt raw. That night, the quiet seemed heavier. The fire popped and cracked, and the wind started to move through the trees outside, a slow, restless sound. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up certain I'd heard footsteps. Not close, not on the porch, further away. Maybe out in the trees. A steady crunch of leaves, then nothing. I held my breath and waited. Minutes passed. The wind moved again, and I told myself it had been a branch falling or a deer passing through. Still, it took a long time to fall asleep again. The third day, I followed the path. The air under the trees was colder, the ground soft with layers of rotting leaves. The trail wound deeper than I expected, bending around thick oaks and crossing a shallow ditch. My boots left prints in the damp earth, but there were others there already, faint, pressed down by time. Not animals. Shoes. About 15 minutes in, I found something odd. A piece of rope, frayed at the ends, tied around a low branch. It hung loose, swaying slightly in the still air. It didn't look fresh, but it hadn't been there long enough to rot, either. I kept going until the light began to fade between the trees. The trail ended at a clearing, maybe 30 feet across. In the center was a large, flat rock, black with moss. The ground around it was bare, the leaves cleared away. I stood there for a while, unsure why the place made my skin crawl. There was nothing obviously wrong. No strange smell, no signs of animals or people, just the bare ground, the rock, and the heavy, watching silence. By the time I made it back to the cabin, The sun was dipping low. I kept glancing over my shoulder on the walk back, though I didn't hear anything behind me. That night was the first time I heard the noise. It was late, maybe past midnight. The fire had burned low, and the cabin was dark except for the faint glow from the stove. I was half asleep when it came, a dull, rhythmic thud. It wasn't close at first. Sounded far off, maybe in the woods. Thud, pause, thud, a steady beat, like someone chopping wood at a slow, deliberate pace. I lay there listening, the blanket pulled up to my chin. The sound went on for a few minutes, then stopped. I didn't move until morning. The days after that blurred together. I tried to write, one of the reasons I'd rented the place, but my thoughts kept circling back to the path, the clearing, and the noise. On the fifth night, the thudding came again. This time, it was closer. Thud, pause, thud. It didn't sound like chopping wood anymore. It was heavier, more hollow, like someone hitting the ground with something solid. Stopped after a while, but I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. By the seventh day, I'd had enough. I decided to leave in the morning. But that night, I made the mistake of looking outside. The sound came again, closer than ever. I crept to the window, moving slow so the floorboards wouldn't creak. The yard was dim in the moonlight, shadows pooling between the weeds. At first, I didn't see anything. Then my eyes caught movement. Something tall, just at the edge of the trees, standing still. I froze. My breath fogged the glass. It didn't move for a long time. Then it turned, slow and deliberate, and stepped back into the darkness of the forest. I packed before the sun came up. I didn't bother with breakfast. I left the fire cold and the dishes unwashed. As I drove away down the dirt track, I glanced once in the rearview mirror. The cabin was already hidden by the trees. But for a second, I thought I saw a figure standing at the start of the path, watching me go. That's why I'll never go back. I can't explain what was in those woods, and I don't need to. I only know that place wasn't as empty as it looked. And sometimes, isolation means you're the only one willing to be SE. I was 34 that year, and I'd been driving alone for 9 hours when the road finally narrowed into a single-lane stretch that snaked between pine forests. It was late August 2016, the air heavy with heat even though the sun was dropping. My shoulders ached from gripping the steering wheel, and my lower back felt stiff from the endless sitting. I'd rented the cabin online 2 months earlier, a small, weather-worn place on the north shore of Lake Mayfield in Washington. The photos had made it look charming: old cedar siding, a porch with 2 creaky rocking chairs, and a view of the water framed by tall trees. I wasn't here for the charm, though. I just needed somewhere quiet, somewhere away from everything. The drive up had been fine until the last 45 minutes. That's when the cell service dropped out and the road started twisting up hills with no guardrails. Houses became fewer until there were none at all, just forest pressing in on both sides. I passed a rusted road sign half buried in weeds. Its letters faded to pale ghosts. County Road 48. By the time I reached the turnoff for the cabin, the sky had gone from bright gold to a deep orange haze. The driveway was little more than a dirt track cut into the hillside. My tires crunched over loose gravel as I climbed the last quarter mile. When the cabin finally came into view, it looked smaller than in the pictures. The cedar boards were darker, almost black in places, from years of weathering. The porch sagged slightly toward one end. I parked beside a crooked woodpile, stepped out, and stretched my legs. The air smelled of pine sap and the faint metallic tang of the lake somewhere below. No traffic sounds, no voices, nothing except the rhythmic hiss of wind moving through the trees. The front door stuck when I tried to open it. I had to lean my shoulder into it before it gave way, letting out a dry groan from the hinges. Inside, the place was dim even with the door open. Just one room with a corner kitchen, a small table, a sagging couch, and a narrow hallway leading to the bedroom and bathroom. The air was stale, carrying the scent of old wood and something faintly sour, like damp clothes left in a bag too long. I dropped my bag on the couch and went to open the windows. The one above the sink stuck halfway up. The one by the couch slid open but let in a cloud of dust and the buzzing of a single fat fly. I waved it away and took in the stillness outside. The lake was maybe 100 yards downhill from the cabin, the shoreline hidden by a slope of thick brush. From the porch, I could only see glimpses of the water, catching light between gaps in the trees. I unpacked slowly, trying to shake off the road. My phone still had no signal. I told myself that was fine. I'd known it might be spotty out here. The listing had said limited service in the fine print, but there was a landline phone in the kitchen, one of those old beige ones with a coiled cord. I picked up the receiver out of habit. No dial tone. I set it back down, telling myself it was just an inconvenience. That first night, I made a can of soup on the small gas stove, ate at the table, and watched the light fade over the lake. By full dark, the forest had gone silent except for an occasional splash from the water. Maybe a fish, maybe something else. I slept lightly, waking several times to the sound of wind pushing against the cabin walls. Each time I lay there listening, the silence seemed deeper after the gusts faded, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The next morning, I made coffee and decided to explore the shoreline. The path downhill was steep, and the brush was thick with spiderwebs that clung to my arms and face. At the bottom, the ground leveled into a strip of damp soil and gray stones. The lake spread out flat and still, its surface broken only by faint ripples. I walked along the shore for maybe 20 minutes before I saw it. A half-collapsed wooden dock jutting into the water. It looked abandoned for years. The boards were warped and blackened with rot. A length of rope trailed from one corner into the water, disappearing into the murk. Something about it made me uneasy. I turned back toward the cabin, telling myself it was just the smell. A faint, almost sweet rot that came off the lake here, thicker than elsewhere. By the third day, I'd settled into a routine. Mornings at the lake, afternoons reading on the porch. No internet, no phone. At night, I lit a single lamp and kept the radio on low. The cabin had an old battery-powered set that could only pick up one station, mostly static with bursts of faint country music. That night, lying in bed, I heard it for the first time. A slow crunching in the gravel outside. I froze, listening. It wasn't wind or an animal scurrying. The steps were deliberate, spaced apart, weight pressing down on loose stone. They stopped after maybe 10 seconds. I lay there, every muscle tense, until I finally worked up the nerve to get out of bed. I moved to the window and pulled the curtain back just enough to look out. The porch was empty, the driveway too. I stood there a long time before I let the curtain drop. The sound came again the next night. Same slow crunch of steps, then silence. I thought about calling someone, but the phone line was still dead. I couldn't even send a text without signal. On the fifth night, I decided to wait by the window. I turned off the lamp and sat in the dark, watching the driveway. The steps came just after midnight. This time they didn't stop. They moved past the porch, toward the side of the cabin. I couldn't see anything, too dark beyond the edge of the porch light, but I heard the faint scuff of movement in the dirt beside the wall. Then nothing. I didn't sleep at all that night. By the sixth day, I'd convinced myself it was some kind of animal, maybe a deer, maybe a stray dog, and that I was overreacting. But that afternoon, walking back from the lake, I noticed something I hadn't before. Deep footprints in the dirt near the side of the cabin. Not deer prints, not paw prints, shoe prints. They were half filled with dust, but the edges were sharp enough to show the tread. They circled the cabin, stopping at the bedroom window. I spent the rest of the day inside, blinds closed, jumping at every sound. The silence of the place, once calming, now felt heavy and watchful. That night, I moved the table in front of the front door, wedging a chair under the knob. I told myself it was just for peace of mind. I sat on the couch with the radio off, listening. The steps came later this time, closer to 2 in the morning. They moved around the porch, slower than before. Then I heard the faint creak of wood, the sound of weight on the porch boards. Something brushed against the front door. A soft scrape, like fingertips or maybe a tool against the wood. I held my breath until my chest ached. The sound lasted maybe 5 seconds, then stopped. When I finally looked out the window 10 minutes later, the porch was empty. I decided to leave the next morning. I packed my bag, locked the cabin, and drove down the dirt track. By the time I reached the main road, I had cell signal again. I pulled over and called the rental company. They told me the cabin hadn't been rented in over a year before me. When I asked about the landline, they said it should have been working. They didn't have any record of maintenance calls. I didn't go back. 2 weeks later, a news article popped up in my feed. Hiker found dead near Lake Mayfield. The picture showed the collapsed dock I'd seen. The article said he'd been missing for months before his body was found submerged just offshore, tangled in rope. They didn't release a cause of death. I never liked cabins much. Not the cozy kind people draw in postcards, with smoke curling from the chimney and snow piled neatly on the roof. I mean the real ones, the kind that look like they've been forgotten for decades, wood bleached gray by the sun, nails sticking out like jagged teeth, the smell of damp rot clinging to the walls, the kind you only stay in because you have no other choice. In the summer of 1987, I ended up in one of those cabins. It wasn't part of any plan. I was 29, working odd jobs after leaving a warehouse gig in the city. My cousin Mark had told me about seasonal work up north in Red Creek. Logging, road repairs, stuff that paid cash. I didn't think much of it until I ran out of rent money. The drive to Red Creek took almost 7 hours from the city. By the time I got there, it was late afternoon, sun low and orange over the pine-covered hills. I met a guy named Ray, thin, worn face, red cap pulled low, who handed me a set of keys and pointed down a dirt road. "Cabin's yours for the season," he said. No smile, just turned and left. The cabin sat maybe 2 miles off the main road, no one else around. I remember the sound my tires made on the gravel, slow crunching, like something chewing. The trees crowded the path so close in places that branches scraped the truck. When I first saw it, I stopped the engine and just sat there for a minute. The place looked like it had been standing since before my parents were born. The logs were dark and sun-cracked. The porch sagged slightly to one side, and the single window in the front was coated with dust so thick it was almost opaque. There was no light inside. I stepped out, gravel shifting under my boots, and got hit with the smell. Old wood, wet leaves, something faintly metallic, maybe rust. The air was still and heavy, like the whole place had been sealed up too long. Inside, the floor groaned with every step. There was one main room with a small table, 2 chairs, a cot pushed against the wall, and an iron stove in the corner. A door in the back led to a smaller room, probably meant for storage. No bathroom. The outhouse was maybe 50 yards behind the cabin, leaning slightly as if it might give up and fall over any day now. I unpacked what little I had, some clothes, a flashlight, a folding knife, a few cans of food, and set them on the table. There was no electricity. The only water came from a hand pump out back that groaned like it was in pain whenever I used it. The first night, I barely slept. The cot was lumpy, and the silence outside wasn't really silence. It was a mix of faint rustles, distant creaks, and the occasional thud of something in the trees. I told myself it was just animals. On the third night, I noticed something. Every evening around the same time, right after the sun dipped but before it was fully dark, the air would change. It would get colder, not sharply, but enough to make the hair on my arms stand up. And the woods would go quiet, completely quiet. No wind, no crickets, no owls, just stillness. The first few times, I tried not to think about it. But then I started noticing other things, like how, in the mornings, the dirt near the pump would sometimes look disturbed, scuffed in strange, uneven patterns, as if someone had been walking there with bare feet, dragging them. Once I found a half-buried nail, bent nearly in half right under the window. About a week in, I came back from work one evening to find the door unlatched. I knew I'd locked it because I'd had to force the swollen wood into the frame that morning. Inside, nothing was obviously missing, but the chair near the table had been moved, angled slightly toward the cot. I told myself I was being paranoid. But that night, when the air turned cold and the woods went silent, I sat on the cot with my knife in my hand. I kept the lantern low, just enough to see the shapes of the room. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke to a soft sound from the storage room. It wasn't loud, more like the shift of weight on old wood. Slow. I stared into the darkness, knife ready, heart hammering. After maybe a minute, it stopped. I didn't move until the sky outside the window began to pale. The next morning, I opened the storage room. Nothing but an old shelf with a broken jar, some rolled up tarps, and a rusted bucket. Still, I started keeping the knife closer. Work in Red Creek was rough, long days clearing brush, hauling lumber. I'd come back sore and half-dead tired, but the unease in that cabin never let me relax. I began to notice marks on the window glass, small smudges like fingerprints, but higher than I could reach standing flat. 2 weeks in, it got worse. One night, just after that strange quiet fell over the woods, I saw something through the front window. Not clearly, just a faint outline, darker than the rest of the trees, standing still about 20 yards away. No movement. I kept staring, but my eyes watered from not blinking, and when I wiped them, the shape was gone. The next day, I walked out to where I thought I'd seen it. The ground there was soft from recent rain, and I found prints. Not animal, human, bare feet, toes splayed wide. The tracks led deeper into the woods, but I didn't follow. That night, I pushed the table against the door. I didn't sleep. Just before dawn, I heard the pump handle squeak once. Slow, like someone testing it. Then nothing. From then on, every night felt the same. The cold air, the dead quiet, the faint sense of something just outside, waiting. I started counting the days until I could leave. But then it happened, the thing that made me pack up and never go back. It was my 19th night there. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of something dragging along the porch. Not footsteps, more like weight being pulled. The boards creaked under it. I held my breath, knife ready. Then the sound stopped right outside the door. I could hear breathing. Slow, deep, not mine. It stayed there for what felt like hours, but was probably less than a minute. Then the breathing moved toward the window. I didn't look. I just sat frozen, listening to the faint scrape of skin or fabric against the glass. When I finally dared to glance, I saw it. A hand. Pale, thin, pressed flat against the dusty pane from outside. Long fingers spread wide, the nails chipped and dark. It stayed there for maybe 3 seconds. Then it was gone. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. As soon as the sun was up, I grabbed my things, threw them in the truck, and drove out without looking back. I didn't tell Ray. I didn't tell anyone in Red Creek. I still don't know who it was or what they wanted. All I know is that they were patient. They knew the quiet spots, the times when no one would be around. They came close enough to touch the cabin while I was inside, awake. It's been years, but sometimes, when the evening air turns cold and the world goes still, I remember that hand on the glass, and I wonder if they ever stopped looking for cabins like mine. The road narrowed the farther I drove, the forest closing in on both sides. My headlights threw weak beams across endless trunks, each one looking the same as the last. The asphalt had turned to cracked gravel miles ago, and now even that had given way to dirt, uneven and rutted from long-forgotten tires. My old truck groaned every time I dipped into a rut, and the steering wheel jerked under my hands. It was late afternoon, but under the thick canopy it already felt like dusk. The air was dense, damp, and still. My phone had been out of signal for the past hour. I hadn't seen another car since the last gas station. A squat, faded place with peeling paint and a clerk who barely looked at me. The directions I'd been following weren't even from a GPS. They were scribbled on a piece of paper. I'd gotten them from an old listing online. It was supposed to be a weekend retreat. A cabin deep in the woods, away from everything. That was the whole point. I wanted quiet. I wanted no one around. The cabin was supposed to be about 12 miles from the main road. I kept glancing at the odometer, counting down. The forest was thick enough now that I couldn't see more than a few feet off the sides of the road. The ground was covered in brown leaves, branches, and old pine needles. The occasional dark slash of fallen trees lay in the undergrowth. When I finally saw the turnoff, I almost missed it. It was just a narrow, muddy track breaking off to the right, barely wide enough for my truck. The sign marking it wasn't really a sign at all, just a piece of wood nailed to a tree with faded letters I could hardly read. I slowed to a crawl and eased the truck in. The track wound deeper, twisting left and right like it was trying to lose me. Branches scraped the sides of the truck with a harsh screech. Puddles splashed muddy water up onto the windshield. I couldn't see the sky anymore, just a tunnel of trees pressing in. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No wind, no bird calls, nothing. Even the sound of my engine seemed muted. Then, through the trunks, I caught a shape. A square, pale gray against the dark green. The cabin. It wasn't as quaint as the photos had made it seem. The wood siding was weathered to the point of splintering. The roof sagged slightly. The windows were cloudy. The front porch leaned on one side, boards missing from the steps. The only thing that looked solid was the front door. Thick, heavy, and dark, like it belonged to a different building. I parked a few feet away and sat there for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled. My eyes scanned the tree line. Everything was still. I could smell damp earth and old wood. I stepped out and my boots sank slightly into soft, wet soil. The air felt colder here than on the road. There was no driveway, no signs of other cars ever coming here. The ground was just a mix of moss, mud, and fallen leaves. I grabbed my bag from the passenger seat and headed for the porch, my boots making dull thuds on the warped boards. One step groaned under my weight, but it held. Inside, the air was stale. It smelled faintly of dust and something faintly metallic like old tools. The main room was small. A sagging couch against one wall, a coffee table scarred with deep scratches, and a stone fireplace blackened with soot. The floorboards were uneven and marked with dark stains in places. In the corner, a short hallway led to what I assumed was a bedroom and a bathroom. The kitchen was barely more than a counter with a sink and an old propane stove. The fridge looked like it hadn't been plugged in for years. I dropped my bag on the couch and tried the light switch. Nothing. I remembered the listing had mentioned solar power, unreliable in overcast conditions. But today the sky was like slate, and the panels on the roof were probably half covered in pine needles. I dug out my flashlight and clicked it on. The beam cut through the dimness but made the shadows in the corners feel heavier. I walked through every room just to be sure I was alone. The bedroom had a narrow bed, thin mattress, and a blanket that smelled faintly of mildew. The bathroom sink was rust-stained, and the mirror over it had a crack across one corner. There was a small window, but it was so cloudy with grime I could barely make out the trees outside. The silence was heavy, pressing on my ears. I'd wanted quiet, but there was something different about this kind. This was the kind that made you aware of every small noise your body made, breathing, the shuffle of your clothes, the sound of your own heartbeat when you held still. I decided to make a fire before it got dark. There was a stack of logs next to the fireplace, though some were soft with rot. I found a few that were solid enough and set them up. The smell of smoke filled the room as the flames caught. The light flickered across the walls, making the whole place feel smaller. Outside, the forest was darkening. I checked my phone again. No bars. The clock on the lock screen told me it was only 6:42, but it might as well have been midnight out there. I ate a can of beans cold, sitting on the floor with my back against the couch, watching the fire. The first sound I heard from outside was faint, a single, sharp crack, like a stick snapping. I drove into the north woods of Minnesota on the last week of October, 1998. The trees were already bare, and the air had the kind of sharp cold that made my breath feel thick. The cabin wasn't mine. It belonged to an old coworker of my father's who had passed away years before. His son had told me no one had been up there in over a decade, and that if I wanted a quiet place to stay for a week, I could have it for free. That was the point. I wanted quiet. The last year in Minneapolis had been nothing but noise. Traffic, shouting, police sirens at night, and the constant hum of people. My job was on edge, my relationship had fallen apart in slow motion, and I was drinking too much. A week away from everything sounded like a cure. The drive took me nearly 7 hours, not because of distance, but because the last 40 miles were on a twisting, cracked road through forest so thick I couldn't see more than 20 feet into it. The asphalt ended about 15 miles before the cabin, turning into a gravel path that narrowed to the point where I kept wondering if I had missed a turn. My pickup's tires threw up loose rock and dust behind me, and every so often, a deer bolted across the road ahead, its white tail flashing in the dim light. When I finally saw the cabin, it looked smaller than I expected. Dark brown logs, a sagging metal roof, one small window in the front, and a screened porch that was missing a panel on one side. The air smelled like wet leaves and old pine needles. The key was supposed to be under a loose board on the porch. It took me 10 minutes to find it, and when I stepped inside, the cold hit me in the face like a slap. The place smelled like it had been closed for a long time. Stale wood, a faint sourness, and something else like old ash. The living room was just a square space with a stone fireplace, a low couch with stuffing coming out of one arm, and a small table with 2 chairs. A single doorway led to a bedroom barely big enough for a bed and a dresser. The first thing I did was light a fire. There was a stack of split logs near the fireplace, and after a little trouble with damp newspaper, I got it going. The warmth took a while to spread. I left my jacket on as I unpacked a few groceries from the cooler I'd brought. The cabin had no power, just a propane lantern and a 2-burner stove. By the time I had a pot of chili simmering, the sun was gone. Out here, dark came fast. One moment the trees were gray shapes, the next they were just shadows. I ate with the lantern hissing beside me, listening to the wind in the trees. No cars, no voices, no city sounds at all. That night, I slept under 3 blankets, still wearing socks and a sweater. The first full day was perfect. I took a walk down to the lake, which was about a 1/4 mile through the trees. The path was overgrown, but still visible, and when the forest opened up, I saw water flat as glass stretching to the far shore. A few ducks were paddling near a patch of reeds. I stood there for a long time, letting the silence soak in. Back at the cabin, I split some of the stacked logs to get smaller kindling and swept out the dust and pine needles that had gathered in the corners. By late afternoon, I was sitting on the porch with a mug of coffee, watching the light fade. The forest turned dark so gradually it was almost hypnotic. But the second night was different. I woke around 2 in the morning. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as I lay there, I realized I was hearing a sound from outside. Not loud, just faint, irregular thumps. Something moving. The sound stopped after a while, and I told myself it was probably a branch shifting in the wind. The third day, the temperature dropped fast. The sky was the color of steel, and the wind cut right through my jacket. I decided to stay near the cabin. I read an old paperback I'd brought, made a pot of coffee on the stove, and kept the fire going. That night, I heard the sound again. This time, it was closer. It wasn't a steady rhythm, just a few slow, deliberate thuds, like someone stepping on the porch. I sat up in bed and held my breath, listening. After a few minutes, I reached for the flashlight beside me and clicked it on. The beam cut across the cabin's front wall. I couldn't hear anything now. After 10 minutes of silence, I lay back down, but my heart kept thudding in my chest. On the 4th day, I noticed something strange. Near the woodpile behind the cabin, there were marks in the ground. The dirt was soft from recent rain, and something heavy had pressed into it. Not quite boot prints, more like deep, uneven ovals. I crouched down and touched one. The edges were crisp, which meant they were fresh. I told myself it was probably a deer, or maybe a black bear. Both wandered through this area. Still, I found myself glancing over my shoulder as I carried logs inside. By evening, the wind had picked up hard enough to make the roof groan. The lantern's light made the cabin's corners feel darker, as if the walls were leaning in. Around midnight, the sound came again. This time, there was no mistaking it. Something was on the porch. I could hear the boards creak. The fire had burned low, and the room felt colder. I grabbed my flashlight again, but before I could switch it on, the sound moved away. Slow steps, then nothing. I didn't sleep much. On the fifth morning, I walked around the cabin again. There were more of those oval depressions in the dirt. They led from the woods to the porch, then around the side toward the back. I thought about packing up and leaving, but the truck was parked 50 feet away down the narrow path, and I didn't like the idea of hauling my things out in the open if something or someone was watching. Instead, I kept busy. I chopped more wood than I needed. I boiled water for tea I didn't drink. I kept the lantern on even during the day. That night, the sound came earlier, just after dark. First, it was faint, then closer, then right outside the wall near the bed. I lay completely still. My heartbeat felt louder than the noise outside. The steps stopped again, and I thought maybe it was gone. But then the porch boards groaned. Slow, deliberate weight shifting from one foot to another. I wanted to get up, to grab the axe leaning against the wall, but I couldn't make myself move. I stayed frozen until the sound faded into the trees. By the sixth day, I'd decided to leave in the morning. I packed my things before sunset, stacking them by the door. I kept the fire high, not for warmth but for light. I sat in the chair with the axe across my lap, listening. The sound came again, but this time it didn't stop at the porch. It moved to the door. I could hear the faint scrape of wood. Then the handle shifted. My throat tightened. I gripped the axe handle so hard my hands ached. The handle rattled again, but didn't turn. After a moment, the sound moved away. The boards creaked under retreating steps, then nothing. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I left as soon as the sky began to lighten. I didn't eat. I didn't even check the lake one last time. I just loaded my truck, tossed the axe into the passenger seat, and drove. About a mile down the gravel path, I stopped. There was something lying in the road ahead. It was a boot, not mine. It was caked with dried mud, the leather cracked from age, but the tread was deep, the same shape as the marks near the cabin. I didn't get out to move it. I drove around it and didn't look back. I never went back to Crow's Lake. It was October of 1998 when I decided to spend a week alone in the cabin. I was 27, and life back in Milwaukee had been grinding me down. The constant noise, the coworkers who never stopped talking about nothing, the flicker of fluorescent lights in my apartment kitchen that I still hadn't fixed after 6 months. My uncle owned a small place up near Iron County, Wisconsin. It wasn't fancy. No electricity except for a gas generator. No running water except the pump outside. He hadn't used it in years, but he kept it because it sat on a piece of land you couldn't really buy anymore. 40 acres of mixed pine and birch, the kind of place where the road ends and what's left is just trees. I left on a Wednesday morning before sunrise. The drive was 4.5 hours, but I took my time, stopping for gas, a coffee, and a couple of extra propane canisters. The weather had been cold that week, colder than usual for October. When I got out of the truck at the last gas station before the county line, the wind cut straight through my jacket. I remember thinking I should have brought the heavier one. I told myself it wouldn't matter. I'd have the propane heater and the wood stove. I'd be fine. The last stretch was all dirt road, rutted and narrow, with overgrown branches scraping against the sides of the truck. When I finally pulled into the small clearing where the cabin sat, the sky had that pale, flat light you get before noon in the fall. The place looked almost smaller than I remembered. A single-story rectangle with peeling green paint and a tin roof. A stack of firewood leaned against the east wall, covered with a warped sheet of tin to keep the snow off. The pump stood a few yards out front, a crooked handle sticking up like it might break if you pulled too hard. Inside, it smelled the same as it had when I was a kid. Dust, old pine boards, a faint sourness from the wood stove that had probably never been cleaned properly. There were only 3 rooms. A main room with the stove and a small table, a bedroom with a lumpy mattress, and a storage room that mostly held mouse-chewed tarps, rusty tools, and a broken fishing pole. I spent the first couple of hours unloading the truck. I set my supplies on the counter: canned soup, beans, bread, instant coffee, a bottle of whiskey I'd picked up even though I'd told myself I wasn't going to drink much. I brought in the propane heater and set it near the bed, but I didn't turn it on yet. Instead, I lit the stove with the small pile of kindling my uncle had left, then split some larger logs from the stack out back. My breath showed in the air while I worked. By the time I got the stove going properly, the tips of my fingers were stiff from the cold. The first day passed quietly. I walked down to the creek about a quarter-mile away, found it running low but steady, the water as clear as glass. I stayed out until the light started to fade, then headed back and made a small dinner. Afterward, I sat by the stove for a while, watching the shadows move on the walls. The kind of silence out there isn't just the absence of noise, it's thick, almost heavy. I slept well that night, though I woke once to the sound of the wind pushing against the cabin. Felt normal. Nothing about it bothered me. It was the second night that things started to feel off. That afternoon, the temperature had dropped further. By the time the sun went down, the air outside was sharp and dry, the kind that stings when you breathe too deep. I'd brought in extra wood so I wouldn't have to go out again after dark. The generator had been running for an hour, just enough to give me a bit of light in the main room while I read. I turned it off at 9 to save fuel. After that, it was just the flicker of the stove. I was lying in bed, still awake, when I heard something outside. Not the wind this time. It was more deliberate, a crunch in the snow. Then another. I froze, listening. My first thought was deer, but deer don't usually come that close to the cabin, not with the smell of smoke and a human presence. I counted the steps in my head. 5, 6, then they stopped. I waited. A minute passed. 2. Then came another sound, softer. A dragging noise, like something being pulled slowly across the ground. My mouth had gone dry. I told myself it could be anything. A branch fallen from a tree, a raccoon digging. Still, I sat there for what felt like an hour before I finally eased out of bed. The floorboards creaked under my weight. I didn't want to open the door, not without knowing what I was stepping into. So I just stood there in the dark, staring toward the window. The glass reflected the faint orange glow of the stove. Beyond it, nothing, just black. When I woke in the morning, I wasn't sure if I dreamed it, but when I stepped outside, there were tracks in the frost. Not boot prints, not deer, something heavier. They led from the tree line straight toward the cabin and stopped just short of the pump. It was October of 1998, and the air already felt sharper than usual for that time of year. I had been driving for over 5 hours before I turned off the paved road and onto a narrow dirt path that barely fit the width of my old Ford truck. The path twisted through tall pines and birches whose leaves had mostly fallen, crunching under the tires in dry bursts. The cabin wasn't mine. It belonged to my uncle, though he hadn't been there in years. He told me about it once over a family dinner. Deep Lake Cabin, he called it. Though the lake itself was more like a dark pond hidden deep in the forest. He had bought it decades ago for hunting trips, but life had gotten in the way. The way he described it made me curious. So when I needed a place to be alone for a while, away from work, people, noise, I remembered his cabin and asked if I could use it. He gave me vague directions, something about taking the second right after the fire road, then following it until I felt like I was lost. That was his wording. I figured he meant it was remote. The deeper I drove, the more the dirt road narrowed. Branches scratched the truck's sides, and sometimes I could feel the wheels sink into soft ground. My cell phone had already lost signal an hour earlier. The sun was lowering, sending that orange-gold light through the trees and stripes, and I knew I had about 30 minutes before it dipped below the horizon. When the cabin finally appeared, I almost drove past it. It sat 30 yards back from the road, partly hidden by overgrown shrubs and a sagging wire fence. The roof looked intact, though leaves had piled thick in the gutters. The wood siding was dark, weather-stained, and the windows were dull with grime. I parked near the fence and grabbed my duffel bag. The air was quiet. Not the kind of quiet you get in town, but the kind where your ears start to strain for sound. I could hear my own breathing, the faint tick of the truck engine cooling, and somewhere far off, the slow drip of water. The key my uncle had given me was small and old, with rust at the edges. It fit the front lock with a stiff turn. The door opened to a musty smell that hit me hard. A mix of damp wood, stale air, and something metallic. The inside was dim. The cabin had only one main room with a short hallway leading to a bathroom and a small bedroom. The furniture was minimal: a low couch, a square table with 2 chairs, a wood-burning stove in the corner. Everything had a thin coat of dust, except for one spot on the table where the dust was disturbed, like something had been there recently and was moved. That caught my eye, but I shrugged it off. Maybe my uncle had come by in the last few months and set something there. I set my bag in the bedroom and decided to look around before it got dark. The windows all had heavy curtains, which I left open for light. Outside the bedroom window, I could see the faint glimmer of water through the trees. Deep lake. I walked down to it. The ground was soft with wet leaves, and the air smelled faintly of algae and cold mud. The lake was small, ringed by trees leaning in like they wanted to touch the surface. The water was still, dark enough that I couldn't see more than a foot down. There was a rickety wooden dock jutting out, some boards missing. Standing there, I realized just how far I was from anything. No cars, no power lines, no human noise. It was a kind of isolation that felt both freeing and unsettling. Back inside, I set up my things. I unpacked some canned food, a flashlight, a small hunting knife my dad had given me years ago. The cabin had no electricity, just a few lanterns and candles in a box by the door. The stove used chopped wood, and there was a small stack next to it. By the time I lit my first lantern, the sun was gone. The cabin took on a different kind of darkness, heavy and close, the kind you can almost feel pressing against the windows. I made a simple dinner of beans and bread, then sat at the table listening to the wind move through the trees. That's when I heard it. It was faint at first, a dry crack like a twig breaking under weight. I froze, spoon halfway to my mouth. Another crack, then a shuffle of leaves. Could have been an animal. Deer, raccoon, maybe even a bear. The woods were full of them. But what bothered me was the rhythm. Not random rustling. It was spaced out, deliberate. I stood, the spoon clinking against the bowl, and went to the window. The lantern light only reached a few feet outside, and beyond that was nothing but black. I waited, staring. Another sound, this time closer. A faint scrape, like a shoe sole on wood, came from the porch. I stayed perfectly still, my eyes locked on the front door. My heart was thudding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The sound stopped. The silence stretched out until I started to doubt what I'd heard. I picked up my flashlight and slowly moved to the door. I didn't open it, just pressed my ear to the wood. Nothing. I told myself it was probably an animal brushing against the porch, maybe sniffing for food. I forced myself to sit back down and finish eating, but my stomach had already tightened up. Every small noise outside made me look up. That night, I barely slept. The bed was cold, the mattress thin. I kept the lantern on until it burned low, shadows swaying on the walls. At some point, I must have dozed off, but I woke abruptly in the early hours. This time, the sound wasn't outside. It was in the cabin. A faint creak of floorboards, the kind that only happens when weight moves across them. I stayed in bed, my breathing shallow, ears straining. The creak came again, not in the bedroom, but in the main room. I reached for the hunting knife on the small table beside me, my hand shaking. I listened for what felt like hours, but the sound didn't come again. Eventually, the cold forced me to move. When I checked the main room, it looked the same as before. No open doors, no moved furniture. The only difference was the disturbed dust spot on the table. It was bigger now. It was late September 2004 when I decided to spend a long weekend alone at a cabin my uncle owned near Weller Lake in northern Minnesota. I was 28 then, working as a mechanic in Duluth, and I hadn't had much of a break that year. The cabin was small, about 45 minutes from the nearest town, and you had to drive a single-lane dirt road for nearly 7 miles to even get close. After that, it was another 300 yards on foot through damp pine woods. My uncle had owned it since the late 80s, but it barely got used except in deer season. The first thing I noticed when I got there that Friday afternoon was how quiet it was. I'd grown up in rural areas, so I was used to silence, but this was the kind of quiet where you could hear your own heartbeat. The lake was still, the air a little warmer than you'd expect for late September, but heavy and damp. There was a smell in the air, pine sap, wet leaves, and that faint metallic tang you get near still water. The cabin itself was one room with a small side bathroom and a tiny loft you could sleep in if you wanted to climb the ladder. There was a wood stove in the corner, an old propane lantern, a table, 2 chairs, and a bed against the far wall. The windows were small and covered with thin curtains. The door was solid wood, older than me, with a simple latch and a deadbolt that stuck if you didn't jiggle it. I unloaded my stuff from the truck. A cooler of food, a backpack, a duffel bag with clothes, a couple of books, and my uncle's old .30-30 rifle he insisted I take. Not because of people, he said, but because of things in the woods. By that, he meant black bears and the occasional moose that wandered too close. I wasn't too worried. I'd been hunting before and never had trouble. By the time I got the fire going in the stove and unpacked, the sun was low over the lake. The glassy surface reflected the pink and orange streaks in the sky, and a loon called somewhere far off. I remember thinking this was exactly what I needed. No phones, no work, just quiet. That night, I cooked some beans and sausage on the little propane burner, read for a while, and went to bed early. I didn't even light the lantern much, just the fire in the stove and a flashlight when I needed it. I slept light, like I always do in new places. I woke up once to the sound of something moving through the leaves outside, slow and deliberate, probably a deer. I rolled over and went back to sleep. The next morning, I made coffee on the propane burner, ate some bread and peanut butter, and decided to walk around the lake. It wasn't big, maybe a mile around, but the ground was uneven and soft from recent rain. The woods felt different in the daylight, but still heavy, like the air itself was pressing in. About halfway around, I noticed something odd. A section of the ground near the shoreline looked churned up, like someone had dug and then filled it back in. Not fresh, maybe a week or so old. The soil was dark and damp, and there were boot prints around it. Big ones, larger than mine, with a deep tread. That didn't sit right with me. Nobody should have been out here except me and maybe some hunters later in the year. And even then, there wasn't much reason to dig by the water. I kept walking, telling myself it was probably a fisherman burying something. Fish guts, bait, whatever, but the thought stuck in my head. Back at the cabin, I read, cleaned my uncle's rifle, and sat by the lake for a while. I didn't see another person all day. Around dusk, I noticed something else. Across the lake, maybe 200 yards away, a faint column of smoke rose through the trees. It wasn't from my chimney, it was too far away, on the opposite side. I couldn't see the source, just the smoke drifting upward in the still air. I didn't remember any other cabins in that direction. It got dark fast, and I didn't like staring across the water, so I went inside, locked the door, and stoked the stove. That night, I slept worse. I woke up twice. The first time, I heard something small, maybe a raccoon, scuffling near the cabin wall. The second time, around 3 a.m., I thought I heard footsteps on the leaves, slow and close, too slow for an animal. I held my breath and listened, but they stopped. I stayed awake for almost an hour after that, staring at the ceiling before finally drifting off. Sunday morning, I decided to check out where the smoke had been. I walked around the lake again, this time cutting through the trees where I thought it came from. After about 15 minutes of pushing through damp underbrush, I found it. Not a cabin, not a tent, just a small fire pit with charred wood still faintly warm. And next to it, a pile of old blankets and a plastic tarp stretched between 2 trees like a makeshift shelter. Whoever had been here was gone, but the blankets were damp, like they'd been slept in recently. There were also cans, beans, chili, opened and left on the ground, and a half-empty water jug. I wasn't sure what to think. Could be some drifter or hunter. But the thing that unsettled me most was the way the ground near the shelter was disturbed. Like someone had been pacing back and forth in a tight line, over and over. The prints looked like the same boots I'd seen near the churned-up dirt by the water. I headed back to the cabin, trying to shake it off. Still, I found myself checking over my shoulder more than once. I kept the rifle near me that afternoon. I didn't even fish like I'd planned. I just sat on the porch and listened to the woods. Sometimes I thought I heard faint movement far off. Other times it was just the wind in the pines. That night, I made sure the door was locked, the windows latched, and the rifle loaded. The fire in the stove burned low. I lay in bed listening. Around midnight, I heard it again. Slow, deliberate footsteps in the leaves. This time closer. Then, faintly, the crunch of something against the cabin wall. My mouth went dry. I sat up in bed, the rifle in my hands, and waited. The footsteps circled slowly, once, twice, and then stopped. I didn't move until the first pale light of morning crept through the curtains. When I stepped outside, the ground was damp from dew, and there were fresh boot prints circling the cabin. Same tread, same size, no attempt to hide them. They went off toward the lake and vanished into the underbrush. That was it for me. I packed my gear in less than 10 minutes. I kept the rifle slung over my shoulder as I hauled my bags to the truck. I didn't feel right turning my back to the woods. The drive back down that narrow dirt road felt like it took hours. I didn't see another car, not even near the main highway. When I finally got home, I didn't tell my uncle everything, just that I didn't sleep well and cut the trip short. A few weeks later, though, I saw something in the local paper. A body had been found near Weller Lake, shallowly buried close to the shore. No name released at first, but the article mentioned boot prints found at the site large with a deep tread. I knew without a doubt they were the same ones I'd seen. Whoever had been out there wasn't some lost camper. They'd been watching me, circling the cabin, and for whatever reason, decided to leave me alone. I haven't been back to that cabin since. It was already dark when I pulled off the main road. The gravel under my tires made that crunching sound I've always associated with being far from anything. My headlights cut through the trees, revealing only thin trunks and patches of white where the snow clung to bark. The temperature had dropped fast. I could see my breath even inside the cab. The cabin was supposed to be about half a mile down the narrow trail. I had found it online, an old hunting cabin that someone's uncle or grandfather used to use. They said it had no running water, no electricity, but it was perfect for a quiet week away from everything. I had thought that meant peaceful. I didn't think it meant isolated to the point where my phone had lost signal 10 miles back. The tires skidded slightly on a patch of ice, and I slowed down to a crawl. The trail was narrower than I'd imagined, 1 car wide, with snow piled at the edges where the plow hadn't bothered to go. My headlights caught the glint of nails on a weathered wooden sign nailed to a tree. The paint was mostly gone, but I could make out faint letters. Cabin. An arrow pointed ahead. The trail curved left, climbing a little, and I could see the shadowed shape of the cabin appear between the trees. It sat back in a small clearing, surrounded by pine, the snow in the yard untouched. No footprints, no tire tracks. I killed the engine and the silence rushed in. Not the kind of silence you get in the suburbs at night, but the total kind. No hum of traffic, no barking dogs. Just the soft hiss of wind through needles and the occasional pop of ice shifting on branches. The cabin was small, 1 story, with a sagging roofline and darkened windows. A stack of split logs leaned against the left wall under a tarp. I stepped out of the truck and the cold hit me hard, sharp in my nose, making my teeth ache when I inhaled. My boots crunched in the snow as I grabbed my bag from the back seat and headed to the front steps. The wood groaned under my weight. The key was supposed to be in a tin box nailed under the porch rail. I knelt, brushing away frost, and there it was. I unlocked the door. The hinges complained when I pushed it open, and the smell of old wood, dust, and cold air drifted out. Inside, it was exactly as the pictures had shown. Bare boards, a small wood stove in the corner, a table with 2 chairs, a single bed against the far wall with a wool blanket folded neatly on top. The floor creaked under my boots. My breath hung in front of me. I set my bag down on the table and walked over to the stove. The metal was ice cold to the touch. I found a stack of kindling in a crate beside it and started a fire, feeding it small sticks until the flames caught and began licking at the logs. Soon, A faint warmth began to spread out into the room. I unpacked slowly, taking my time, not because I had much, but because there was nothing else to do. A flashlight, spare batteries, a book, a small camping stove for coffee, canned food, a sleeping bag in case the bed felt too cold. I put my phone on the table even though it had no signal, more out of habit than anything. I kept glancing at the window, where the blackness pressed against the glass. The fire popped and hissed. I kept telling myself it was just a normal night in the woods, but there was something about the stillness that made me uneasy. You start to hear things you normally wouldn't notice. A tiny rattle in the wall, a faint scuff on the roof, a shifting groan in the beams. By the time I'd eaten a can of soup and had my second cup of coffee, it was late. I checked my watch. 10:48 p.m. The fire had burned low, so I added a couple more logs, then climbed into bed, pulling the wool blanket over me. I left the flashlight within reach on the floor. For a long time, I lay there staring at the ceiling. My eyes kept catching on tiny movements of shadow from the firelight. I told myself it was just the flicker from the stove. The wind outside picked up, brushing tree branches against the siding in slow, dry scratches. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up. It wasn't a dream that had pulled me from sleep. It was a sound, a faint crunch outside, on the snow. It was far enough away that I thought maybe it was a branch breaking under ice, but then it came again, more deliberate, slow, like footsteps. I held my breath and listened. The sound stopped. My ears strained for any noise. The stove was still ticking softly as it cooled. Nothing else. After a while, I convinced myself it could have been an animal. Deer, maybe. I rolled over, pulling the blanket tighter, but I didn't sleep well after that. The next morning, the light was weak and gray. I got up and made coffee, my breath still visible in the air until the stove warmed the cabin again. I glanced out the front window while sipping from the mug. That's when I saw them. Footprints in the snow, starting at the tree line and ending just a few feet from the porch. They weren't animal prints. They were boot prints. The snow around them was undisturbed. No extra tracks leading away, just that single line toward the porch. My first thought was that maybe it was from when I arrived, but I had come from the opposite side, from the driveway area. I went outside to check. The tracks were fresh. The edges were crisp, no sign of melting or being filled by falling snow. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved out there. The rest of the day, I tried to tell myself it was fine. Maybe a hunter passing through. Maybe someone from a nearby cabin. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I stepped outside for wood, the trees seemed too quiet, the air too still, as if something was holding its breath out there with me. I stayed inside after the sun went down, the fire burning hot, every creak in the walls making me glance at the window. That night, the noises came again. Slow, deliberate crunches on snow. They circled this time, starting at the front, moving along the side, pausing, then continuing around toward the back. I stayed completely still in bed, my hand on the flashlight, my eyes on the ceiling. I didn't get up. I didn't want to see. Eventually, the sounds faded. I don't remember falling asleep, but I woke to daylight. Outside, more footprints. This time, they went all the way around the cabin, stopping several times near the windows. I walked the whole area, my boots sinking into the cold powder, my breath burning my lungs. No other sign, no discarded trash, no marks of where someone might have stayed. Just prints and the heavy feeling of being singled out in the middle of nowhere. The third night was worse. I had barely turned off my lantern when the noises started again. This time, closer. The crunch was followed by the faintest scrape, like a boot sliding slightly on ice. I heard wood groan near the porch, and then a slow press on the boards outside my door. I gripped the flashlight so hard my fingers hurt. I could see my breath quickening in the beam of moonlight coming through the window. The stove popped loudly, and I flinched. For a moment, the footsteps stopped. Then, retreating crunches, slow but steady, until the silence swallowed them again. I didn't sleep at all. First light, I packed. I didn't even make coffee. I loaded my bag into the truck, my eyes constantly scanning the tree line. The The snow was deeper than before, but I could still make out the fresh set of prints leading from the porch into the woods. They didn't weave or wander. They went in a straight line, like whoever it was had been watching from the same spot every night. When I finally turned the key and heard the engine rumble to life, I felt my shoulders drop for the first time in days. I backed down the trail, tires crunching over ice, eyes flicking to the mirrors. The cabin disappeared behind the trees, but the prints didn't. For a long time, I could still see them running parallel to the trail, just inside the treeline, following until the snow swallowed them from sight. I didn't stop until I hit the main road. The silence of those nights stayed with me for months. Even now, when the wind is still and I hear a faint crunch outside my window, I'm right back in that bed, holding my breath, waiting for whoever was out there to take another step. I'd been on the road for just under 8 hours when the first real signs of fatigue started creeping in. The kind that makes your eyelids feel like they're dragging bricks behind them. I had left early that morning from Duluth, Minnesota, headed northwest into a part of the state where paved roads fade into gravel, and cell service is more of a rumor than a utility. It was October of 2012. I was 29 at the time. My old Chevy Silverado was loaded with enough supplies to last me 3 days. Food that didn't need refrigeration, a sleeping bag, an old .22 rifle for target shooting, and a stack of firewood. I wasn't going camping for fun exactly. I was going to be alone in a cabin that my late uncle had left behind. The cabin sat somewhere off an unmarked dirt trail that branched off County Road 47. I had been there once as a kid, maybe 15 years earlier. I remembered the place vaguely. Dark green siding, a tin roof that made rain sound like a drumline, and a dock that reached into a small lake with water black as oil. I had no reason to go back for years. My uncle lived there alone until he passed away in 2009. The property was left to my mother, who didn't want it, and she handed it to me in 2011. I hadn't set foot on it since. This trip wasn't meant to be recreational. My goal was to check the place out, see what repairs were needed, and decide if I'd keep it or sell it. I wanted to be methodical about it, photograph everything, make notes, and leave before anything about the isolation started to wear on me. The air was sharp and cold as I turned down the unmarked dirt road. Dead leaves blew across it in small flurries. There were no tire tracks ahead of me, and the road itself was narrow. 2 ruts carved into packed dirt with grass growing up the center. The truck bounced over rocks and tree roots until finally, after maybe 15 minutes of slow crawling, I saw the cabin. It looked smaller than I remembered. The paint was peeling from the siding in long strips, and the tin roof was rusted around the edges. One of the 2 windows on the front side was cracked through the middle, a spiderweb of glass frozen in place. The front porch sagged slightly on one side, the wood dark with rot near the steps. There was no sign that anyone had been there recently. I parked close enough that I could keep the truck in sight from the porch. My boots crunched over damp leaves as I walked to the door. It wasn't locked. Inside, the air was stale. It smelled faintly of mildew, with an undercurrent of something metallic, like old pennies or rust. There were cobwebs in the corners, and dust coated the wooden table in the center of the main room. The small kitchen area to the left had a propane stove and a sink that looked like it hadn't seen water in a decade. The bedroom was barely more than a nook with a single bed frame and a thin mattress. I set my pack on the table and unrolled my sleeping bag on the bed. I had no intention of sleeping directly on that mattress. After a quick look through the cabin, I decided I'd start with the outside, see if the dock was still there, maybe check the shed I remembered being somewhere behind the cabin. The dock was there, though a section of the planks near the end had collapsed into the water. The lake itself was motionless, the surface holding an oily sheen that made it hard to see into. The surrounding trees were bare, their branches stretching over the water like skeletal fingers. The shed behind the cabin was locked with an old padlock. I didn't have the key. The roof had caved in on one side, and weeds grew tall around the base. Something about the shed made me uneasy, though I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was the fact that I couldn't see inside. By late afternoon, I had taken photos of everything I thought I needed. The The sun was dropping fast, and the air had that kind of stillness that makes you feel like even the animals are holding their breath. I started a small fire in the metal pit out front and heated a can of chili for dinner. That's when I first noticed the feeling. It wasn't anything dramatic, not at first, just a subtle prickling on the back of my neck, the sense that I wasn't as alone as I thought. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the tree line. Nothing, no movement, no sound. I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me, but the feeling didn't go away. That night, I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the creaks and groans of the cabin as it cooled in the night air. Every so often, there was a faint crunch outside, like footsteps over dry leaves. I tried to count the seconds between them, but they came irregularly, sometimes in pairs, sometimes with long pauses in between. I stayed awake until well past midnight before exhaustion finally pulled me under. The next morning, I found something odd. Near the dock, the wet ground had a set of footprints. They were faint, but clearly human, and they led from the water's edge toward the tree line. The prints weren't mine. These were larger and barefoot. The strange part was that the first few steps coming out of the water were deep and clear, but after about 6 or 7 feet, they faded completely, like the person had stepped onto something solid. Except there was nothing there, just leaves and dirt. I spent the day trying to work on the small repairs I could do without tools. I tightened a loose hinge on the cabin door, swept out the worst of the cobwebs, and patched a crack in one of the window frames. But I kept finding excuses to look out the windows, especially toward the woods behind the shed. Around 3 p.m., I decided to try opening the shed. I found a rusted crowbar in the cabin and managed to pry the padlock open. The door stuck, but with a hard shove it gave way. Inside, the smell hit me first. A damp, sour odor like wet fabric left too long in the dark. There were shelves along the walls, most of them empty, but a few had jars filled with murky liquid. I didn't look too closely. Against the far wall was a pile of old tarps, and next to them, a pair of waders that looked almost new compared to the rest of the junk. Something about the waders made me uncomfortable. They were wet, even though the shed was dry. I backed out, pulled the door shut, and decided I didn't need to know more. That night, the noises came back, more frequent now. This time I could tell they were moving in a slow circle around the cabin, crunching leaves, snapping twigs, stopping for long stretches before starting again. I lay in the dark, my hand resting on the rifle beside me, every muscle tense. When I finally fell asleep, I dreamed of standing on the dock, staring into the water. Something moved beneath the surface, something pale, just out of reach. But no matter how far I leaned over, I couldn't see what it was. The next morning, I found the shed door wide open. I knew I'd shut it the day before. The waders were gone. That was the turning point for me. I packed my bag, loaded the truck, and did one last sweep inside the cabin. As I stepped out onto the porch, I caught movement at the edge of the trees. A flash of pale skin, a bare shoulder disappearing behind the trunk of a birch. I didn't wait. I got in the truck, started it, and drove faster than was safe on that narrow dirt road. I didn't stop until I hit the main highway. When I got home that night, I dumped the photos onto my computer. In one of the shots I'd taken of the lake, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. A faint shape in the water, just beneath the surface, about 10 feet from the shore. It looked like the top half of a human head, eyes just barely visible above the ripples. I never went back to the cabin. 6 months later, the property was listed for sale. Nobody bought it. Last I checked, it's still sitting there, waiting. I remember that trip like it happened last night. It was the winter of 2004, late January, when I decided I needed to get away for a while. I was 31 at the time, living in a one-bedroom apartment in Columbus, Ohio. Life felt small, crowded, and noisy. I'd been working double shifts at a warehouse for months, and my body ached in places I didn't even know could ache. My back felt like it had knots the size of walnuts. My knees hurt when I walked upstairs, and my eyes always burned from the overhead fluorescent lights. I wanted to be somewhere quiet, somewhere far from people. I didn't have much money to spend, so I started looking for cheap, out-of-the-way rentals online. Most were too expensive or too close to tourist spots. Then I stumbled on a listing for a rustic cabin deep in the woods of southeast Kentucky, about an 8-hour drive from me. The photos were grainy and dim, but I could make out a small wooden cabin with a sloped metal roof, set back from a dirt road and surrounded by dense trees. The ad said it had no internet, no TV, and no phone line. It was $125 for the week. That was perfect for me. The drive down was long, quiet, and oddly calming. I left before sunrise, so most of the trip was just me, the road, and the sound of my old Toyota's worn-out tires humming over the asphalt. By the time I crossed into Kentucky, the air had changed. The smell of cold dirt and pine came in through the vents whenever I rolled the window down. The landscape got more and more empty. Fewer houses, fewer road signs. By the last hour of the drive, my cell signal was gone. I followed the directions I had printed out before leaving because GPS wasn't going to help me out here. The paved road turned into a narrower 2-lane one, then into cracked asphalt, then finally into a dirt road that twisted deep into the forest. The further I went, the more it felt like I was driving into some sealed-off part of the world. When I finally reached the cabin, the first thing I noticed was how still everything was. No wind, no cars, no voices, just the sound of my own boots crunching the frozen dirt as I walked up to the front steps. The place looked older than in the photos. The wooden boards on the porch were weathered gray, and the metal roof had rust creeping along the edges. The front door was heavy and stiff when I pushed it open. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old wood and something else, maybe mice. There was a single main room with a bed pushed against one wall, a wood-burning stove, a small table with 2 chairs, and a short countertop with a rusty sink. The kitchen area had no fridge, just a battered cooler sitting in the corner. A narrow doorway led to a tiny bathroom with a cracked mirror and a toilet that looked like it had been scrubbed but still carried faint stains from years of use. I unpacked my duffel bag, tossing my clothes onto the bed, and put my canned food and bottled water on the counter. The rental listing had said the nearest store was about 30 minutes away by car, so I had brought everything I thought I'd need. My plan was to spend the next 7 days reading, hiking, maybe chopping some firewood. The first day passed quietly. I sat on the porch, watching the trees turn black against the sky as the sun went down. At night, the dark was total, so heavy it felt like it pressed against the windows. The only light in the cabin came from the small oil lamp I'd found on the table. It hissed softly when I lit it, the flame flickering shadows across the walls. I woke up around 2 in the morning to pee. The cabin was freezing, the floorboards like ice under my bare feet. As I stood in the bathroom, I noticed how completely silent it was outside. No wind, no crickets, no owls, nothing. It made my skin crawl for some reason. I went back to bed, pulling the blanket over my head. The next morning, I took a walk down the dirt road. Frost covered the leaves like powdered sugar. My breath looked solid in the cold air. About half a mile from the cabin, I noticed something strange. A series of deep grooves in the mud at the edge of the road, like something heavy had been dragged through there recently. It wasn't an animal trail. The lines were too straight, too wide. I crouched to look closer. The grooves cut through the frost, which meant they'd been made after the temperature dropped overnight. That meant someone, or something, had come through here while I was sleeping. Back at the cabin, I tried to push the thought away. People hunted in these woods. Maybe it was just some guy dragging a deer carcass back to his truck. But the idea of someone being that close without me knowing bothered me. I decided to keep the door locked at all times, even during the day. That night, I built a fire in the stove and sat reading by the dim orange light. Every now and then, I thought I heard something outside. A faint crunch of leaves like footsteps. I'd pause, holding my breath, listening. The sound would stop. It happened 3 times before I finally convinced myself it was just animals. On the 3rd night, I woke to a noise. It was faint but distinct. A slow, deliberate scraping against the wall outside, somewhere near the front door. My stomach tightened instantly. I lay there, frozen, trying to figure out what it could be. It wasn't wind. It wasn't an animal pawing. It was slower than that, more careful. The sound stopped, then started again, this time lower, near the base of the wall. I reached for the flashlight I kept next to the bed and clicked it on. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I thought about opening the door and shining the light outside, but something deep in my gut told me not to. Instead, I just sat there in the bed, gripping the flashlight, staring at the door. After what felt like forever, the sound stopped. I stayed awake until sunrise, my muscles stiff from sitting so still. When I finally stepped outside, the air was brutally cold. The ground crunched under my boots as I walked to the spot where I'd heard the noise. There were marks in the dirt. Not footprints exactly, just small depressions, uneven, like someone had been crouched there. The frost was disturbed in several places. My eyes followed the marks and saw that they led off into the trees. The rest of the day felt wrong. Couldn't relax. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind made me jump. I found myself checking the windows constantly, scanning the tree line for movement. On the fifth night, it happened again. This time, the sound came from the back of the cabin, near the bathroom. A slow scrape, then a faint metallic tap, like something hitting the siding. I didn't move. I barely breathed. My hands were sweating even though the air inside was freezing. When morning came, I checked again. The marks were there, more of them this time. Crouch-like impressions, leading in from the woods and back out again. By the seventh day, I was done. I packed my bag before sunrise, not even bothering to make breakfast. I loaded everything into the car, started the engine, and drove out without looking back. About 20 minutes down the dirt road, I passed a truck parked half off in the trees. The driver's side window was rolled down, but no one was inside. A few feet behind it, the dirt showed the same kind of drag grooves I'd seen earlier that week. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. When I got home, I unpacked and shoved my bag into the closet. I didn't tell anyone about what happened, not because I thought they wouldn't believe me, but because I didn't even want to say it out loud. The cabin's listing disappeared from the rental site about a month later. I still think about those marks sometimes. Whoever or whatever was coming to the cabin wasn't lost. They knew exactly where I was, and they came back more than once. I never liked the cold. Not the kind that makes your breath visible for a second and then disappears. I'm talking about the kind that seeps through the cracks of wood and into your bones, the kind that makes your fingers feel thick and clumsy even in gloves. But that was the kind of cold I had chosen for myself when I drove up to Greywater Lake in late November of 1998. I was 29 back then, old enough to know better, young enough to think I could handle anything. The cabin wasn't mine. It belonged to a guy my uncle knew who had moved down south years earlier. From what I understood, he kept the place for hunting season and occasionally lent it out to family or friends if they wanted a getaway. It was a squat little thing, maybe 30 feet across at its widest, built from dark pine logs that had soaked up decades of rain and wind. It sat about 100 yards from the water's edge, on a small rise that gave you a good view of the lake through the bare trees. The drive there had been 3 hours of cracked asphalt roads, followed by 30 minutes of narrower dirt track that wound through the forest like it didn't want to be found. The air had gotten colder the farther I went. By the time I parked in the dirt clearing out front, the sun was dropping behind the tree-line and my hands were stiff on the steering wheel. Inside, the cabin smelled like old smoke and damp wood. There was no electricity, no plumbing, just a wood stove in the corner, a battered kerosene lamp on the table, and a hand pump in the kitchen that groaned out icy water from a shallow well. The windows were small and the glass wavy with age, the kind that made the outside world look slightly bent and unreal. I hadn't come here for fun. I'd come because I needed space, the kind that people in towns and cities couldn't give you. I'd been running freight for a small trucking company, working long hours, and my head had been full of noise for months. Schedules, bills, the constant hum of other people's voices. I figured a few days with no one around might reset me. The first night, nothing happened. I stacked some split logs by the stove, cooked a can of chili over the flame, and read by lamplight until my eyes burned. Outside, the wind kept brushing against the walls, and sometimes it sounded like footsteps in the leaves, but I told myself it was just the trees dropping their last load of dead branches. I slept in the small back room on a narrow bed with a wool blanket pulled up to my chin, and I didn't dream. The next morning, I woke early to frost on the inside edges of the window glass. My breath puffed white as I pulled on my boots and stepped outside. The lake was still, a dull sheet of pewter under the gray sky. I walked down to the edge, boots crunching on frozen leaves, and knelt to touch the water. It was so cold it burned. I spent the day doing small chores, chopping more wood, checking the roof for leaks, making sure I had enough kindling. I had brought a week's worth of food, mostly cans and dry goods, and stashed them on a high shelf to keep them away from mice. It was around mid-afternoon when I noticed something strange. About 100 yards down the shore, just at the edge of the trees, there was a faint line in the dirt. It looked like someone had dragged something heavy from the forest to the lake. The line went straight into the water and disappeared beneath the surface. I walked over, boots slipping slightly on the damp ground, and crouched to get a better look. The drag mark was deep, as if whatever made it had sunk into the soil. There were no footprints. I told myself it was probably a fallen branch someone had pulled in for firewood. Still, my eyes kept going back to that smooth groove in the dirt, the way it cut through the leaves like it had been made yesterday. That night, the wind picked up. The cabin creaked with every gust, the logs settling against each other. I sat by the stove, reading until I heard it. A sound under the wind, low and irregular. Not an animal cry, not the snapping of branches. More like something heavy shifting its weight. It came from somewhere beyond the cabin walls, then stopped. I waited, heart pushing at my ribs, but it didn't come again. The next morning, I found the drag mark again. This time it was longer, fresh, cutting a wider path to the water. And next to it, half hidden in the leaves, was a small piece of cloth. It was blue, torn, and stiff with frost. I turned it over in my hand and saw that the edge had been frayed, not cut clean. Something in me tightened. This wasn't just wind or animals. Someone had been here. I started noticing more. Across the lake, almost directly opposite the cabin, there was a dark shape just inside the treeline. At first, I thought it was a boulder, but when I looked again later in the day, it was gone. Once, while splitting logs, I caught movement at the edge of my vision. The pale flash of something moving between trees, and when I turned, there was nothing. By the fourth day, I'd stopped going far from the cabin. I kept the kerosene lamp lit even in daylight, just so I could see clearly inside. The wind seemed sharper, slicing through my jacket, and the lake looked darker, almost black. The drag mark appeared every morning now, sometimes in a new place, sometimes overlapping the old one. I didn't sleep much. I'd lie there listening to the stillness, which wasn't really still at all. There was always some faint rustle, some muffled thud that didn't belong. I started keeping the axe inside, leaning it against the wall by the bed. On the sixth night, the sound came again, louder now. A slow, deliberate shifting, like someone walking through leaves and stopping every few steps. My hands felt cold and wet even though the room was warm from the stove. I didn't move. I just listened. It stopped right outside the wall. I could hear my own breathing, fast and shallow. Then something brushed against the logs, a faint scrape, followed by another. I sat up, gripping the axe, and waited for the door to move, for the latch to rattle. But nothing happened. When daylight came, I stepped outside and saw prints in the frost. Not boots, not bare feet either. Just deep impressions, uneven, as if whoever made them had been limping or carrying something heavy. They led from the treeline to the cabin wall and then back again. I knew then that I had to leave. It took me less than an hour to pack. My hands shook the whole time, not from the cold, but from the feeling that I was already too late. When I stepped outside, the forest was silent. The drag mark was there again, leading to the lake. I walked to my truck and froze. The passenger door was open a few inches. I hadn't touched it since I arrived. Inside, the glove box was hanging open and the papers were scattered on the seat. The small hunting knife I kept in there was gone. I didn't waste another second. I started the engine, backed out of the clearing, and drove fast, the dirt road jarring my teeth. The whole time, I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see someone step out into the track behind me. By the time I reached the main road, my chest hurt from holding my breath. I didn't stop until I was 20 miles away. I never went back to Greywater Lake. 2 months later, I heard that a hiker had gone missing in that area. They never found him. They only found his pack by the water's edge, with a deep drag mark leading into the lake. I remember the smell first. Not wood smoke, not pine, but that faint sourness of a building shut too long, of air that hasn't moved in months. The cabin wasn't mine. I'd rented it for a week because it was cheap, too cheap, and I'd convinced myself that it was because no one wanted to hike that far into the woods for such a small place. I'd parked my car on a dirt pull-off, shouldered my pack, and walked the last mile and a half on a narrow trail overgrown enough that my jeans were soaked through with dew before I got halfway there. It was late afternoon when I arrived. The light was already turning gold through the trees, slanting long shadows over the clearing where the cabin sat. The boards were gray from age, and a few shingles on the roof had slipped. There was a woodpile against one wall, half rotted, the bottom layer black with fungus. The front door was heavy, warped a little at the bottom so it scraped when I pushed it open. Inside, the air felt cool and stale. Dust motes floated in the sunbeam from the single window. The place was just one room with a loft. A small iron stove sat in one corner, a low table, and a narrow bed with a thin mattress and a quilt that looked like it had been there since the 80s. The floor creaked when I stepped. My boots left faint marks in the dust. There was a small counter with a rusty sink and an old hand pump, but I already knew from the rental listing that there was no running water. The pump squealed when I tried it, and after a few strokes it coughed up a little brown water that cleared slowly. I dropped my pack on the bed, feeling the give of the mattress springs. My plan was simple: 3 days alone, hiking, writing in my notebook, maybe fishing if the stream nearby had anything in it. I'd been telling myself I needed quiet, that I was burnt out, that the city noise was grinding me down. The cabin was cheap and the hike in had been peaceful enough. Still, there was a weight in my chest I couldn't quite name, and I kept glancing at the single small window like I was expecting to see something. That first night I unpacked, lit a couple of candles because the single light bulb didn't work, and ate a cold dinner from the supplies I'd carried in. Outside, the forest went dark quickly. The trees pressed in on all sides. The only sound was the wind through the pines and the occasional dry pop from the stove. I thought I'd sleep easily after the hike, but I kept waking. The bed springs squealed every time I shifted. The window seemed darker than the rest of the room, a square of black. I lay there listening to the soft ticking of cooling metal from the stove and the faint rustle of mice in the walls. The second day I explored the area. The cabin sat on a rise above a small stream that ran fast and cold over stones. The banks were muddy in places, scattered with deer tracks. Upstream there was a low dam of fallen branches, maybe the work of beavers, though I saw no sign of them. I followed the water for a while, then cut back into the trees. The forest was thick, the ground uneven with roots and moss. In places, the undergrowth opened into small clearings choked with waist-high grass. I didn't see another human all day. No boot prints, no cigarette butts, no cut stumps or bright survey tape. That had been part of the appeal when I'd booked the place. But by mid-afternoon, I caught myself glancing over my shoulder more than once. The silence wasn't total. There were birds, the occasional creak of branches, but it was dense, a kind of silence that settled in your ears. That night, I built a small fire outside in the ring of stones near the cabin and sat with my back to the wall, watching the flames. I was halfway through my second cup of instant coffee when I heard it. Not much, just a faint thump from the woods, far off but distinct in the still air. Could have been a branch falling, could have been an animal. I stayed there until the fire burned low, eyes flicking between the trees, then went inside. Around midnight I woke again, no idea why. My skin felt tight, the way it does when you've been startled awake. The candle had burned out. I could hear something faint through the wall. A soft, slow scrape, then a pause, then another. It was coming from the side of the cabin, low to the ground. I lay there, holding my breath. After a while, it stopped. I didn't get up. Morning brought nothing unusual. No tracks, no marks on the cabin wall. I told myself it had been a raccoon or a possum, maybe nosing around for food. Still, I kept my pack closer that day. I took shorter walks, never straying more than a few hundred yards from the cabin. The air felt heavier, like the sky was holding back rain. By the fourth day, I'd stopped pretending I was comfortable. I checked the woods from the window often. I noticed little things, how the woods seemed to go quiet for stretches, how sometimes a breeze would shift and carry with it a smell like damp soil and something faintly metallic. That evening, I was splitting kindling beside the cabin when I heard that thump again. Closer this time. I froze, the hatchet in my hand. The sound came again, then stopped. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the cabin sounded sharper. Once, I heard that same slow scraping outside again, and this time I thought I could feel the faintest vibration through the floorboards. I stayed still until it faded. By morning, I'd decided I was leaving a day early. I packed slowly, keeping the door shut. It was cloudy, the light flat and gray. I slung my pack, checked the cabin one last time, and stepped outside. The woods were still. The path out was narrow and rutted, and my boots made almost no sound on the damp ground. About half a mile from the cabin, I saw it. Off to the side of the trail, in a patch of flattened grass, was a shape. Not quite a pit, but a shallow depression maybe 3 feet across. The grass inside was matted, the dirt bare in spots, and in the center was something small, white, smooth. A bone. Maybe from a deer, maybe not. I didn't look too closely. I just moved faster. The last stretch back to my car felt longer than it should have. When I finally reached the dirt pull-off, I could see the thin layer of dust on the hood, undisturbed except for one thing. A set of prints, not boots, not paws. Bare feet. They'd come from the direction of the trail and circled the car once before vanishing back into the trees. I drove without stopping until I hit pavement. The whole way, I kept glancing in the mirror at the empty road behind me, half expecting to see someone there. I didn't, but I never went back for the security deposit, and I never told the owner why. The cabin's still listed online, last I checked. The photos look the same, woodpile, warped door, thin mattress, but the price is even cheaper now. And if you zoom in on the last picture, the one of the clearing, you can just see it in the far corner, grass pressed flat in a perfect shallow circle. It was late October, 2013, when I drove up north to stay at a small cabin I'd rented for a week. I had never been that far into the woods before. The map I printed showed the cabin sitting a few hundred feet from a narrow lake, surrounded by pine and birch trees, the nearest town being about 30 miles south. I thought it would be the perfect break. Quiet, no people, no traffic, no calls from work. The drive took me 7 hours. By the time I reached the turnoff from the main highway, it was already close to dusk. The dirt road was rough, packed with frozen ruts and scattered with fallen branches from the previous night's windstorm. I had to slow down to a crawl. My headlights cut through the trees, catching the white flash of birch bark and the occasional dark shapes of deer vanishing into the undergrowth. The last stretch to the cabin was barely a road at all, more like 2 faint tire tracks. My tires crunched over patches of frozen mud, and the forest seemed to close in around me. I started to wonder if I had missed the place entirely, but then I saw a clearing ahead. The cabin sat at the far edge, small, dark, and still. It wasn't much to look at, just a single-story wooden structure with a metal roof and a crooked porch. The siding was weathered gray, the kind of color wood gets when it's been left to the elements for decades. The only sign of life was a thin trail of smoke curling up from the metal chimney. I figured the rental owner had come by earlier to heat the place before I arrived. The air was colder than I expected. My breath came out in pale clouds as I grabbed my bags from the car. The smell of pine and damp earth was thick, mixed with a faint trace of wood smoke. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The interior was cramped but warm. A small wood stove sat in the corner, glowing faintly with embers. The furniture was old but clean. A plaid couch, a narrow wooden table, a couple of mismatched chairs. The floorboards creaked under my boots. Against the far wall was a short hallway leading to a single bedroom and a bathroom. I set my things down and noticed how quiet it was. Not just peaceful quiet, dead quiet. No wind, no rustle of leaves, no distant traffic. The only sound was the faint tick of cooling metal from the stove. I unpacked slowly, stacking my food in the tiny kitchenette, folding my clothes into the single dresser in the bedroom. The cabin didn't have electricity. Instead, it had a couple of battery-powered lamps and a lantern. I had brought extra batteries, knowing I'd need them. That first night, I sat at the table with a book, reading by the dim glow of the lantern. Around 9, I decided to step outside before bed. The cold hit me harder than I expected. The clearing was lit only by a pale slice of moon, the surrounding trees standing like black walls. I could barely make out the glint of the lake through the trees. There was no sound, not even an owl. That struck me as strange, but I brushed it off. I went back inside, fed the stove a couple more logs, and went to bed. The next morning, I woke up to frost coating the inside edges of the bedroom window. My breath fogged in the air. The fire in the stove had died overnight, so I got up, shivering, and started it again with the dry logs stacked by the door. After breakfast, I decided to walk down to the lake. The ground was hard and brittle under my boots. The trees thinned as I reached the shoreline. The water was still, reflecting the gray sky like a mirror. I noticed something odd near the edge of the lake, a line of footprints in the frozen mud. They weren't mine. These looked older, pressed deep into the ground, and heading in both directions along the shore. They were boot prints, but I didn't see anyone else around. I followed them for a short distance, but they vanished near a patch of reeds. I figured maybe someone had been here earlier in the week, maybe a hunter or fisherman. Still, the sight made me feel watched in some way. By midday, the sky had turned darker, heavy with low clouds. I decided to stay close to the cabin. I spent the afternoon cutting kindling from a pile of split logs out back. While I worked, I kept glancing toward the tree line, half expecting to see someone. But there was nothing, just the same stillness, the same quiet. That night, I sat by the stove listening to the occasional snap of burning wood. I thought I heard a faint crunch of snow outside, like footsteps. But when I went to the window, I saw only the dark clearing and the faint outline of my car. On the third day, the unease started to grow. I woke early to find something strange. The stack of firewood by the door looked different. Some of the logs were shifted slightly out of place. I told myself maybe I had stacked them poorly, and they'd shifted when the wind picked up. Later, while walking to the lake again, I saw fresh boot prints in the mud. They were the same size as the ones I'd seen before, but these were newer. The odd thing was they led directly toward the cabin from the direction of the woods and then back again. I stayed inside for most of the day after that. Every so often I'd get up, check the windows, then sit back down, telling myself I was just overthinking things. That night, I woke to the sound of something scraping faintly against the cabin wall. It was slow, irregular, like the drag of a branch in the wind. But there was no wind. I lay there in the dark, listening, heart pounding. The sound came again, closer to the window. When I finally got the courage to look, I saw nothing but blackness outside. No movement, no shape. I stayed awake until dawn, staring at the window. By the fourth day, I wanted to leave, but the road back to the highway was in bad shape, and I didn't want to risk getting stuck that far from help. I figured I'd stick it out for the last few days. I started keeping the axe from the woodpile inside the cabin, leaning against the wall near the bed. I also began locking the door at all times, even during the day. That afternoon, while splitting wood, I saw movement at the far edge of the clearing. Just a flicker, like someone stepping back into the trees. My skin prickled. I didn't go to check. The hours dragged that evening. I kept the lantern on and the stove burning, listening for any sound. Around midnight, I heard the crunch of footsteps on frozen ground, moving slowly around the cabin. My breathing went shallow. I gripped the axe and stayed still. The footsteps stopped, then started again, circling. I waited, every muscle tense. Finally, after what felt like hours, they faded into the distance. On the last night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about the prints by the lake, the shifting firewood, the sound of someone walking outside. I stayed in the chair by the stove, axe across my knees. Just before dawn, I heard movement again. Quick, sharp footsteps approaching the porch. Then the creak of the wooden steps. I moved to the window and saw a figure in a dark coat, standing at the edge of the porch, facing the door. They didn't move for several seconds, just stood there. Then they stepped back, turned, and walked into the woods without a sound. I didn't wait any longer. I packed my things in minutes, loaded the car, and drove out before the sun had fully risen. The narrow road back to the highway was worse than before, but I didn't stop. By the time I reached the main road, I finally felt my shoulders loosen. I didn't look back. I never found out who it was. I never went back to that cabin. Even now, years later, I sometimes wake at night, thinking I hear footsteps outside. I had been driving for almost 8 hours by the time I turned off the main road. The late September air was crisp, with the kind of sharp coolness that makes you keep one hand near the heater and one on the wheel. My old pickup rattled as I eased it onto a narrow dirt track. The sign had been half hidden under overgrown brush, Pine Hollow Road in faded green paint. I almost missed it. I wasn't going to the cabin for a vacation. I didn't do vacations. I'd rented it from a guy I knew from work who said it was quiet, good for clearing your head. I needed that. The past 3 months had been a mess. Late nights at the mill, a breakup that left the apartment feeling like a box I couldn't breathe in, and a creeping restlessness I couldn't shake. The cabin wasn't even mine for free. I'd paid him a small sum for 2 weeks, mostly for the key and the assurance no one would bother me. The road was just wide enough for one vehicle. Tall pines loomed on both sides, their branches reaching over like they were stitching the sky shut. I could smell damp earth through the vents. There hadn't been rain for a week, but the shaded parts of the road still looked wet. The deeper I went, the less I could see of the sun. The cabin appeared suddenly, a squat rectangle of dark wood with a sagging metal roof, sitting on a small clearing of dead grass and dirt. One corner of the porch leaned slightly lower than the other, like it had been slowly giving in for years. The front door was painted red, though most of the color had flaked away, leaving raw wood beneath. I killed the engine and listened. The sound of the motor faded into absolute stillness. No birds, no rustle of small animals in the brush, just the distant hum in my ears from the long drive. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the faint smell of damp wood and dust. The floorboards groaned under my boots. There was no electricity, just a gas lamp on the table, a wood stove in the corner, and a few mismatched chairs. A small kitchen took up one wall, a sink with a pump, a 2-burner propane stove, and shelves lined with old cans of soup and beans. I dropped my bag on the floor and set about checking the place. The bedroom was barely big enough for a narrow bed and a dresser with a cracked mirror. The bathroom was just a tin-lined corner with a bucket and a curtain. The whole place felt like it had been forgotten for years. That first night, I built a fire in the stove and sat in one of the chairs, just listening to it crackle. The silence outside was heavy, almost pressing in against the cabin. I figured the woods would be full of noises at night, crickets, wind, maybe the call of an owl, but it stayed dead quiet. Around midnight, I woke to a sound I couldn't place. Not the pop of wood in the stove, but a dull, slow thud. I lay still, eyes on the ceiling, trying to figure it out. Came again, farther away. Maybe a branch falling. The trees here were old and tall. It could have been anything. By the next morning, I'd shaken it off. I spent the day cutting some fallen branches near the cabin for firewood and walking the edge of the clearing. The dirt road I'd come in on twisted away into the trees so sharply that I couldn't see more than 30 yards of it at a time. I hadn't seen a single other cabin or vehicle since turning off the main road. That night, I heard it again. The same slow, deliberate thud. Not close, but not far enough for me to ignore. I sat up in bed, the blanket pulled to my chest, and strained to hear. It would sound once, then nothing for maybe 20 or 30 seconds, then again. The rhythm was too regular for falling branches. On the third day, I found something strange. About 50 yards into the trees behind the cabin, I came across a dead deer. Not unusual in the woods, but this one wasn't eaten the way you'd expect. Its body was whole, but its head was gone. Completely gone. No blood in the leaves, no drag marks. Just a clean space where its neck ended. I backed away without touching it. The air smelled faintly metallic. I kept glancing over my shoulder on the walk back. That night, the thud came again. Louder, closer. By the fifth day, I started keeping the axe inside with me. I set it next to the bed and moved one of the chairs under the doorknob. I knew it wouldn't stop anyone determined to get in, but it made me feel better. I stopped walking far into the trees. I noticed other things too. Twice, I found fresh boot prints in the dirt by the edge of the clearing, deep enough to be recent, pointing toward the cabin. Not mine. They were larger than my size and spaced far apart, like the person had been taking long strides. On the eighth night, I didn't just hear the thud. I heard slow footsteps in the leaves outside. They moved along the side of the cabin, paused, then shifted toward the back. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The fire had burned low, and the only light came from the faint orange in the stove. Something brushed the wall, a dragging sound, like fingers trailing along the wood. My mouth went dry. The steps circled the cabin once, then faded. To first light, I checked outside. The dirt showed partial prints, blurred from the dampness overnight. I followed them toward the trees until they vanished into the shadows. On the 10th day, I decided to leave early. I packed my bag, doused the fire, and locked the door. The road felt even narrower on the way out. The trees seemed to press in closer. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing where the clearing ended. It wasn't until I reached the main road that I let out the breath I'd been holding. I didn't go back for my refund. Weeks later, I saw a news report from that area. A hunter had been found in the woods near Pine Hollow. No gear, no weapon. His head was missing, just like the deer. I shut the TV off and sat in the dark for a long time. I knew then that if I had stayed one more night, I might not have been the one telling this story. I never planned to be in that cabin for so long. I thought it would be 2, maybe 3 nights, enough to clear my head, get away from the noise, and figure out whether I really wanted to quit my job or if I was just burned out. The place belonged to a guy I knew from work, Steven. He'd bought it from an old couple who used it as a hunting cabin. It was about 9 miles from the nearest paved road. In the northern part of Minnesota, a cluster of woods called Red Pines. It was February 1998. I was 32, single, and worn down from too many late nights at a job I didn't like anymore. Steven wasn't using the cabin and said I could have it for free, no power, no plumbing, just a wood stove, a propane lantern, and a cot. He handed me the key and told me to bring snowshoes if I wanted to get in without sinking waist deep. The drive north was quiet. I'd left my car in a turnout where the snowplow had cleared a little space, then strapped on my snowshoes and pulled a sled with my gear. Sleeping bag, food, 2 5-gallon jugs of water, a small hatchet, and a .22 rifle. The rifle wasn't for hunting, just in case. Out there, just in case could mean anything from coyotes to an injured deer to something worse. The snow was powdery, light on top but heavy underneath. The air bit at my cheeks as I moved. No sounds but the slow crunch of the snowshoes and the wind dragging itself through the trees. Took me just under 3 hours to reach the cabin. The roof had a fat blanket of snow, and the chimney stuck out like a black finger. The door was a little warped, and I had to throw my shoulder into it before it would open. Inside smelled like dry wood, old dust, and faintly of rodent droppings. The first night was easy. I unpacked, stacked my food on the counter, checked the windows. There were 4, 1 in front, 1 in back, and 1 on each side. 2 were small and square, with warped wooden frames that barely held the glass. Snow hissed against them as the wind picked up after sunset. I lit the propane lantern, warmed the place with the wood stove, and read until I fell asleep. The second day, I woke up with the sense that the woods were somehow closer. It was a strange thought. Trees don't move, but the pines outside the front window seemed denser, like I'd woken up deeper in the forest than where I'd fallen asleep. Maybe it was the light or how the snow had shifted in the night. I shook it off. I spent most of that day splitting wood and making sure the stove was drawing properly. The chimney had a little creosote buildup, but it wasn't bad. I boiled snow to save water from the jugs. By mid-afternoon, the temperature dropped hard. I could feel it in my teeth when I breathed in. That night, I woke to a sound. Not the wind. This was sharper, almost like metal dragging against wood. I stayed still, listening. Came again, then stopped. I told myself it was ice shifting on the roof, or maybe a loose piece of flashing. But when I got up to check, the sound was coming from the back wall, near the small window above the counter. Outside was just white darkness. The beam from my flashlight swallowed after a few feet. I stayed up another hour before going back to bed. The next morning, I found the marks. They were faint, but they're thin scratches in the wood just under the back window, about 2 feet long in clusters. Not claws exactly, but not clean like a knife. I touched them. The wood had fresh splinters. That day, I kept glancing at the tree line while I worked. The cabin sat in a small clearing, maybe 40 yards across, surrounded by pines so tall they looked like they leaned inward. By late afternoon, the wind carried a smell, faint, sour, like meat that had been left out too long. I thought maybe something had died out in the woods. The smell got worse after dark. It came and went in waves, strong enough to make me swallow hard. Then came the noise again, this time slower, more deliberate, like someone dragging a stick against the wall, pausing, then starting again, always at the back of the cabin. I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I checked the scratches again. They were deeper now and lower to the ground. I walked the clearing's edge, looking for tracks. All I found were patches of snow that looked disturbed, melted and refrozen, the edges uneven. On the fourth day, the air changed, still cold but heavier, quiet in a way that pressed against my ears. No bird calls, no wind through the needles, just a dull stillness. That night, the scratching turned to pounding. Not hard enough to break anything, but heavy, slow, spaced out, like someone knocking with their fist, waiting, then knocking again. I sat by the stove with the rifle in my lap, watching the lantern light jitter against the walls. By morning, I knew something was wrong in a way I couldn't ignore. I packed my sled, planning to head back early. But when I stepped outside, the clearing looked off. The snow around the cabin had been churned up, but not like footprints. More like something heavy had been dragged in looping, irregular paths. The disturbed patches stretched to the trees, then vanished. Halfway to the road, I started feeling like I was being followed. I didn't hear anything over my own movement, but every time I stopped, the air behind me felt thick, watchful. My pace picked up. My breathing fogged hard in front of me. 2 miles from the road, I found the first real sign. A strip of fabric hanging from a branch at eye level. Blue flannel, torn, stiff with ice. I didn't own anything like it. By the time I reached the turnout, I was sweating under my layers. My car was there, but the driver's side door was open. I knew I'd locked it. Inside, the glove compartment was hanging open, papers scattered. Nothing taken, but everything moved like someone had gone through it. I got in, slammed the locks down, and drove south without stopping until I hit Duluth. That night, in a motel bed with the heater rattling, I could still smell that sour, rotten scent in my hair. I didn't go back to the cabin. Stephen asked for the key and I gave it to him without explanation. 2 weeks later, he called me at work, said he'd gone up there, found the place exactly as I'd left it, except for one thing. The scratches on the back wall were higher now, almost at eye level. I told him to sell it. He laughed. I didn't. I remember the first time I saw the cabin. It wasn't much to look at. 1 floor, faded red paint, and a sagging roof that seemed like it had given up holding itself together years ago. It sat on the edge of a narrow dirt road in northern Montana, surrounded by tall pines that blocked most of the light. The smell of wet soil hung in the air, heavy and thick. The place didn't feel welcoming, but that was part of the reason I chose it. It was late October 2017. I was 31, and I'd just gotten out of a rough stretch in my life, the kind of months where every day you wake up with that metallic taste in your mouth, wondering how much worse things can get. I told myself I needed time away from people, from noise, from everything familiar. I booked the cabin for a week through some obscure listing I found buried in an online rental site. No photos of the inside, just a 2-sentence description. Remote cabin, private, with stove and pump well. Bring supplies. I liked the bluntness of it. The drive up took hours. The last stretch wound through dense forest, the kind where the trees crowd the road so close that you feel like you're driving through a tunnel. The road narrowed to a single lane, ruts deep from rainwater. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, my hands were stiff from gripping the steering wheel. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Not the peaceful kind of quiet. Not the kind you get on a warm summer night where you can hear crickets and the wind in the grass, but a blank, heavy silence, as if the place had been holding its breath for years. I stepped out of the car. The air was cold enough to bite at my cheeks, even through my jacket. The dirt under my boots was damp, almost spongy, from a recent rain. The cabin's front steps were uneven, the wood dark with rot in places. The door was just a single, warped panel of wood with a cheap brass knob. When I turned it, it stuck for a second before giving way. Inside, it smelled of dust, mildew, and faintly of old smoke, like someone had once used the wood stove often, but not recently. The floor was bare wood, dark and scratched. There was no electricity. The only furniture was a small table, one chair, and a cot with a thin mattress that sagged in the middle. A few nails stuck out of the walls, empty where maybe pictures or tools once hung. The first hour was just me unpacking. Canned food, bottled water, a sleeping bag, a flashlight, extra batteries. I had a small propane stove for cooking, though the listing had mentioned a wood stove in the corner, square and black with a pipe disappearing into the ceiling. The pump well was outside, maybe 20 yards behind the cabin, next to an old shed. The pump's handle was stiff, but after a few tries, water gushed out. Cloudy at first, then clearer. It was ice cold, numbing my hands instantly. I filled a pot to boil later, just in case. By late afternoon, the light was fading. Out here, the sun seemed to drop faster, the trees swallowing the last of it. I lit a small fire in the wood stove. The draft was poor, and smoke drifted back into the room before finally pulling upward. The sound of the fire popping and shifting was the only thing breaking that crushing silence. That night, I didn't sleep much. I lay in the cot listening to the wind outside. Every so often, a branch would creak, or pine needles would scrape against the roof. At one point, maybe around 2 in the morning, I heard something heavier, a dull thud against the outer wall. I told myself it was a branch falling, maybe a pine cone hitting the siding. I didn't get up to check. The next morning, I saw tracks in the mud near the pump well. At first, I thought they were from a deer, long, narrow impressions, but the spacing was odd. They were almost in a straight line, not the staggered pattern I usually saw from deer tracks, and they were close to the cabin, circling around the back before disappearing into the trees. I told myself it was nothing worth thinking about. Out here, animals came close to cabins all the time. I boiled water for coffee and ate a can of beans cold, staring out the small window as the fog clung low to the ground. The second day was uneventful except for the feeling that kept creeping up on me, like the air was pressing down harder than it should. I went for a walk along the dirt road, not seeing another car, person, or even fresh tire marks. The cabin sat alone for miles in either direction. By the third night, I started noticing the small things. How the woods seemed quieter after dark, like even the wind didn't want to move through the branches. How the shadows from the firelight would bend strangely along the warped walls. How every so often, I thought I heard faint movement outside, but when I held my breath and listened, it would stop. That night, the sound came again, the dull thud against the wall. But this time, It was followed by a slow scraping, like something dragging lightly along the wood siding. My throat went dry. I reached for the flashlight and aimed it toward the window, but the glass was so grimy that the beam barely made it through. I didn't see anything. I stayed awake until the fire died. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under. The next morning, there were more tracks in the mud, but they were different now. Deeper, pressed in at odd angles, as if whoever made them was putting more weight on one side. I noticed something else. The pump handle was wet, as if it had been used. I hadn't touched it since the day before. I decided to keep the door locked, even during the day. On the fourth night, it escalated. I was lying in the cot, fire burning low, when I heard the sound again. Thud, scrape, pause. Then, faintly, the crunch of footsteps on the soft earth outside. Slow, deliberate steps. My pulse thudded in my ears. I didn't move. I kept my breathing steady, eyes fixed on the ceiling. The steps circled the cabin, stopping now and then. At one point, they were right outside the door. The wood creaked faintly, as if someone had put their weight on the step. It lasted maybe 5 minutes, though it felt like hours. Eventually, the sound faded into the distance. When I stepped outside at dawn, the air was colder than it had been all week. Frost clung to the grass. The tracks were clearer now, boot prints. Heavy ones, the tread worn down but still visible. Whoever it was had walked in a wide loop around the cabin, passing the pump well, the shed, then back toward the road. The realization settled in my gut like a stone. I wasn't alone out here. That day, I kept busy splitting the few logs I had for the stove, stacking them inside the cabin. I checked my phone, but there was no signal, not even a flicker of one bar. The nearest town was at least a 40-minute drive down the dirt road, and I didn't like the idea of leaving my supplies here alone. I told myself I'd leave in the morning. That night, the footsteps came again. But this time, there was no circling. They came straight to the front steps, paused, then the sound of the doorknob turning, slow, steady pressure against the latch. The door rattled faintly. I sat up in the cot, heart pounding so hard I felt it in my teeth. After a moment, the knob stopped turning. There was silence. Then the faint sound of breathing, slow, deliberate, just on the other side of the wood. I stayed frozen until it stopped. The next morning, I didn't waste time. I packed everything into my bag, threw it into the car, and started the engine. The frost on the windshield blurred the world outside, but I didn't care. I backed out fast, tires crunching over the dirt. 100 yards down the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Someone was standing at the edge of the trees, right where the cabin's clearing met the woods. They weren't moving, just standing there watching. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I drove until the trees thinned and the dirt gave way to pavement. By the time I reached the highway, the tightness in my chest eased slightly. But I knew I'd never forget the shape of that figure in the tree-line, the way they stood so still, like they'd been waiting all along. I never went back to that part of Montana, and I never again booked a place without asking exactly who else might know I was there. I had been driving for nearly 7 hours when the first thin flakes of snow began to fall. The air outside was dry and sharp, the kind that seems to scrape your throat when you breathe it in. The rental truck's heater had been blowing on high since I'd left the last small town, but it still felt like my toes were frozen. I kept glancing at the map folded on the passenger seat, though I already knew the route by memory. The road was nothing more than a narrow strip of cracked asphalt winding through endless pines, and I hadn't seen another vehicle for nearly an hour. The farther I went, the more the forest seemed to close in around me. Each mile felt like another step away from the world I knew. It was late January, 1998. I was 32 years old then, single, and the only reason I was out here at all was because I'd promised myself I'd finally take some time alone, away from the noise of the city. An old coworker had mentioned his uncle owned a small cabin deep in the mountains, barely used, and that I could have it for a week if I wanted. Seemed like a good idea when I agreed. Somewhere quiet, no distractions, no phone calls. I'd packed a week's worth of food, a stack of books I'd been meaning to read, and a small portable radio. The The sun had already started dipping lower when I finally saw the turnoff. The road leading to the cabin was little more than 2 tire tracks worn into the dirt, now frozen solid and slick with thin ice. I slowed down, the tires crunching over patches of snow as I eased the truck forward. The forest seemed darker here. The trees were older, taller, their branches heavy with clumps of snow. My headlights swept across trunks scarred with age, deep grooves in the bark. There was a strange stillness to the air, no wind, no movement. Even the falling snow seemed to drift lazily, as though reluctant to touch the ground. The cabin came into view suddenly, tucked in a clearing no bigger than a backyard. It was a squat, rectangular structure with a steep roof, weathered wood siding, and a single narrow chimney. A set of uneven wooden steps led up to the front door. The windows were dark, and the whole place looked as though it had been standing here for decades, barely touched. I parked off to the side and killed the engine. The silence hit immediately, so complete it almost rang in my ears. I grabbed my duffel from the passenger seat and trudged up the steps. The key the coworker had given me was cold against my fingers, and when I turned it, the old lock clicked open with a sound that echoed faintly inside. The interior was as plain as the outside. A single room with a small kitchen area against one wall, a wood stove in the center, and a low bed in the far corner. The air inside was stale and cold enough to see my breath. Dust covered everything in a fine layer, and a faint smell of old wood and dampness hung in the air. I set my bag down and took a slow walk around. The only light came from the gray sky through the windows. There was no electricity, just a lantern hanging from a hook and a box of matches on the counter. A stack of firewood was piled neatly next to the stove, but most of the pieces looked old, like they'd been sitting there for years. It took nearly 20 minutes to get a fire going. I'd forgotten how stubborn cold wood can be. When the flames finally caught, I sat in front of the stove, letting the heat sink into me. My gloves were still on, and I could feel the tips of my fingers tingling painfully as they warmed. By the time I had unpacked, night had fallen completely. The darkness outside the windows was thick and absolute, the kind that swallows everything beyond the glass. I ate a can of soup heated over the stove and read by lantern light until the fire died down to glowing embers. When I finally lay down in bed, the silence was so complete it felt almost unnatural. No wind, no rustling branches, nothing. It was the kind of silence where your own heartbeat sounds too loud. That first night I slept poorly, waking several times to the sound of faint creaks from the wood stove as it cooled. At one point, I thought I heard something faint outside, like snow crunching underfoot, but when I sat up and listened, the silence returned. The next morning, the snow had stopped. The clearing was covered in a thin white crust, unbroken except for my own tracks from the truck to the cabin. I stepped outside, my boots crunching through the frozen surface. The air was painfully cold, and the sunlight made the snow glare so bright I had to squint. I spent most of the day gathering more firewood from the pile behind the cabin, splitting the larger logs with the old axe I found leaning against the wall. The wood was half-rotten in places, crumbling under the blade, but I managed to stack enough for the night. The second night, I heard it again. It was sometime after midnight when I woke, unsure why. I lay still, eyes open in the dark, listening. At first, there was nothing, just the soft ticking of the stove cooling. Then, faint and deliberate, came the sound of snow compressing under weight. It was slow. Step, pause. Step, pause. Somewhere just beyond the cabin walls. I didn't move. My mind scrambled for explanations, a deer, maybe, or some other animal. But the steps were too heavy, too measured. They circled slowly, crunching through the snow, until they stopped near the front steps. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tight. Nothing happened. No knock, no movement. Just silence again. Eventually, I must have fallen back asleep, though it felt like hours before I did. The next morning, I went outside to check. The sun was weak and pale, the cold deeper than before. I walked around the cabin slowly, scanning the snow. There were tracks. They weren't animal prints. They were boot prints, large ones, the edges sharp and fresh, leading from the tree line to the steps, then around the side of the cabin and back toward the woods. I followed them a short distance before they vanished into the shadows between the pines. I stood there for a long time, staring into the trees, the hairs on my neck prickling. Whoever it was had come right up to the cabin in the middle of the night. No reason, no sign they'd tried to break in, just circled, then left. That day I kept busy, more out of an effort to stay warm than anything else. But I couldn't shake the thought of those tracks. The forest felt different now, not peaceful but watchful. The third night, I barely slept at all. Every creak of the cabin, every shift of the wind sounded like footsteps. I kept the lantern lit, its glow throwing shifting shadows across the walls. It was around 2 a.m. when I heard the steps again. This time, they came from the backside of the cabin, slow and deliberate. My skin went cold even as the fire burned in the stove. The steps stopped just outside the back wall, no more than 5 feet from where I lay. Minutes passed. I could hear my own pulse in my ears. Then, as slowly as they had come, the steps moved away, fading into the distance. At dawn, I checked again. More prints in the snow circling the cabin just like before. The same size, the same pacing. I knew then that I wasn't imagining it. That night, I didn't go to bed at all. It was late January of 1998 when I decided to take a trip to the old hunting cabin my uncle used to talk about. It was tucked into a slope of pine forest in the northern part of Montana, about 15 miles from the nearest dirt road, and as far as I knew, no one had been there in years. The idea had started as a stubborn thought in my head, to spend a week alone away from people, away from the city noise, away from the hum of streetlights that made the night feel fake. I was 32, restless, and tired of the same 4 walls in my small apartment. I told myself the cabin would be a reset. The drive took most of the day. The last hour was nothing but narrow dirt road and patches of old snow that had crusted into gray ice. The forest grew denser the farther I went, branches pressing over the road like a tunnel. When I finally parked, the air felt heavier. There was no sound except the low creak of the truck cooling off and the occasional wind sliding through the pine needles. I loaded my pack, heavier than I liked, with food, water, a small camp stove, a lantern, a folding saw, and an old .22 rifle more out of habit than fear. I slung the straps over my shoulders and started walking toward the trail. The snow here was uneven, a mixture of powder and frozen ruts from deer or maybe elk. I kept my eyes on the prints just to keep my pace steady. The trail was barely a trail. In some places it disappeared under drifts, and I had to scan ahead for broken branches or the faint rise of the ground where I knew it continued. The sun started to drop faster than I'd planned, painting the snow in that dim blue that comes before night. By the time the roofline of the cabin showed through the trees, my legs ached and my breath came out in harsh bursts. The cabin was smaller than I'd imagined, its logs dark and damp from years of weather. The front steps sagged to one side, and the door was nothing more than rough planks with an old padlock. My uncle had left the key with me years ago, saying I'd probably never use it. The lock was stiff, but it opened. Inside, the air was stale and dry. Dust lay on everything. Old chairs, a table with one leg braced by a rock, shelves lined with jars that looked like they'd once held beans or fruit, but now were empty except for cobwebs. The small iron stove sat against the far wall, its chimney pipe still attached. In the corner was a narrow cot with a thin mattress. No electricity, no plumbing, no insulation worth a damn. Just 4 walls against the wind. I unpacked quickly, setting my lantern in the middle of the table and laying out my sleeping bag on the cot. I stacked some kindling by the stove and lit a fire, which smoked for a while before catching. I made a quick meal, canned chili heated on the stove, and ate it slowly, listening to the fire pop. By then, the sky was black. That first night, the quiet pressed in hard. I could hear my own heartbeat if I sat still. Every creak of the wood sounded like a footstep outside. At one point, I thought I heard snow sliding off the roof, but when I opened the door, the night was still. My breath curled into the cold air and was gone. The next morning, I woke to a dim gray light through the single window. The temperature had dropped, and frost lined the inside of the glass. I made coffee on the stove and stepped outside. My boots crunched on the frozen ground. The forest stretched away in all directions, silent except for the slow groan of trees shifting in the cold. I spent the day cutting wood and checking the area around the cabin. There were animal tracks everywhere. Rabbits, deer, something larger I thought might be moose. I kept the rifle slung over my shoulder, the way my uncle had shown me. Not because I expected trouble, but because it felt wrong to move through that silence unarmed. That night, the wind came up. It started as a low moan through the trees and built until it rattled the walls. The fire burned low, and I fed it slowly, not wanting to use too much wood this early in the week. I kept thinking about the roof, how old it looked. I imagined snow piling until the beams bowed. I lay there for hours before finally drifting off. The third day, I noticed the tracks, not animal boot prints. They came from the tree line about 30 yards out and stopped behind the cabin, right at the back wall. The snow there was shallow, but I could see where someone had stood for a while. No trail away from it, no trail leading in except from the trees. My first thought was that maybe it was old, from some hunter years ago, but the edges were sharp, not melted or filled with frost. I crouched there for a long time, staring at them. The rest of that day, I couldn't focus. I checked the woods in every direction. Nothing moved. No smoke from another cabin. No sound of an engine. Nothing. That night, I kept the rifle by the cot. The wind had died, but the silence was heavier than before. By the fourth day, the weather turned. Snow started falling just after dawn, thick and wet, muffling the world even more. I spent most of the day inside, rationing wood and food. Every time I looked at the window, the snow was higher. I tried to read an old paperback I'd brought, but every creak of the cabin pulled my eyes up. That night, I woke to the sound of footsteps in the snow. Slow, deliberate, coming from the front this time. My mouth went dry. I reached for the rifle, but the sound stopped. I waited, muscles tense, staring at the dark. When I finally moved to the window, there was nothing but snow falling, erasing everything. The next morning, there were no tracks. Either they'd been covered completely, or I'd imagined the whole thing. I told myself it was probably snow sliding off the trees, but the feeling didn't go away. On the sixth day, I decided to leave early. The snow had slowed, and I figured I could make it back to the truck before dark. I packed quickly, keeping my eyes on the tree line. The air was colder than before, my breath hanging heavy. Halfway down the trail, I saw them again. Fresh prints, boots, leading ahead of me, spaced in a way that meant whoever it was had been moving fast. My chest tightened. I followed them for maybe 20 yards before they veered off into the woods. I stood there, staring into the dark pines, the silence pressing in. I didn't follow. I kept walking, faster now, not looking back until the truck came into sight. My hands shook as I unlocked the door. When I drove away, the road was slick, the tires slipping in places. I didn't stop until I hit pavement again. I never went back to that cabin. Weeks later, I told myself it was nothing, some hunter passing through, maybe even just my own nerves. But sometimes, late at night, I remember how sharp those prints were in the snow, and how they stopped right at the back wall of the cabin, as if whoever made them had been standing there, listening. And I wonder how long they stood. I never thought I'd end up spending a week alone in a cabin miles from anyone, in the dead middle of a Montana winter. I'd never even been that far north before, but my Uncle Peter had offered me the use of his cabin at Ashwood Ridge. He told me it would be good for me, quiet time away from the noise. Back then, I thought quiet meant peaceful. I didn't realize it could also mean dangerously silent. I was 28 at the time. I'd been working construction jobs in Spokane for years, living paycheck to paycheck, never really getting ahead. The idea of a free cabin for a week sounded like a chance to breathe. Maybe even sketch out some plans for the small woodworking side business I'd been dreaming about. I packed my truck with a week's worth of supplies. Dry food, a cooler of perishables, a jerry can of gas, 2 wool blankets, extra clothes, a lantern, a box of matches, and my uncle's old .22 rifle he'd given me when I turned 21. I threw in a pack of cigarettes too, even though I'd been trying to quit. Cold weather always made me smoke more. It was the first week of February 1996. I left early in the morning, skies overcast but dry. The first few hours were easy. Long stretches of highway, pine forests stretching into the distance, low mountains in the background. The further north I went, the thinner the traffic got. Gas stations became rare, and the towns I passed through looked frozen in time. Faded signs, shuttered stores, snow piled high against the sides of weathered buildings. By the time I turned off the last paved road onto a dirt track, the snow had started falling. It wasn't heavy, but it was steady, the kind that you don't notice building up until the world around you has changed color. The track was narrow, with tall spruces crowding in on both sides. My tires crunched over the hard-packed snow. My uncle had told me the cabin was about 5 miles in from the turnoff. No cell reception here, not that I'd expected it. Just static on the radio and the muted thud of snowflakes hitting the windshield. After about 20 minutes of slow driving, I spotted it. A small wooden structure set back from the track, half hidden among the trees. The cabin was single-story with a steep roof to shed snow. The wood siding was dark and weathered, the windows small. Smoke-black stains above the chimney showed it had been used often. There was no driveway, just a rough clearing where I pulled the truck in. The cold hit me hard when I stepped out. Sharp, biting air that stung my lungs. The snow was already a couple inches deep, and more was coming. I hauled my gear up onto the porch. The door was unlocked, just as Peter had promised. Inside, the air was stale and faintly musty, like old wood and closed-up rooms. The cabin was one big room, with a bed tucked into one corner, a small kitchen area with a wood stove, and a table and chair near the single front window. A stack of split logs sat by the stove, and there were more piled against the back wall outside. The first thing I did was get the stove going. I crumpled some old newspaper, added kindling, and struck a match. Soon the cabin was filling with the dry crackle of burning wood, the heat slowly pushing back the cold. I unpacked my gear methodically. Blankets on the bed, food on the counter, rifle leaned against the wall within arm's reach. I kept my boots on for a while. The floorboards were icy. That first day passed quietly. I took a walk around the clearing, noting the tree line and the lay of the land. The cabin sat in a shallow dip, with a frozen creek about 50 yards out. Beyond that, the forest thickened. The snow made everything muted, the only sound the distant groan of trees shifting in the wind. I cooked some canned chili for dinner, read a few chapters from an old paperback I'd brought, and turned in early. The wind picked up after dark, rattling the cabin's walls, but I slept fine. The second day, the snow was deeper. It had fallen all night, and the sky was still heavy with it. I decided to stay close, cut some more firewood, clear the snow from around the cabin, check the roof for buildup. That's when I noticed the tracks. They weren't mine. These were longer strides, narrower footprints, pressed deep into the snow. They came from the trees, passed right by the side of the cabin, and went off toward the creek. The edges were softened by falling snow, so they couldn't have been fresh, maybe a day old. My first thought was a hunter or trapper. Nothing strange about that, except, why come so close to the cabin if no one was home? And why not knock? Still, I brushed it off. People wandered out here, maybe just curious. That night, I woke up to a sound, faint but distinct. A single creak like weight shifting on the porch boards. I held my breath, listening. The wind was still blowing, but beneath it, I thought I heard something else. A soft, irregular crunch in the snow moving away. I reached for the rifle, sat there in the dark for a while, and eventually convinced myself it was probably an animal. Deer, maybe. Still, I kept the rifle by the bed. On the third day, the snow eased off, leaving a pale, colorless sky. I decided to walk down to the creek. The snow was knee-deep in some places, and the cold seemed sharper now that the wind had dropped. When I reached the creek, I saw more tracks. Not the rounded prints of deer, but human boot prints. Fresh ones. They came from the opposite bank, crossed the frozen creek, and headed toward my cabin. I followed them back, my stomach tightening. They led right up to the front porch, right up to my door, and then they turned and went back the way they'd come. I checked the cabin over. Nothing was disturbed. The door was still locked, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been standing there, maybe looking in through the small front window, watching. I never meant to stay out here alone. The plan was only to be gone for 2 nights, 3 at most. The cabin wasn't even mine. It belonged to an old coworker named Ray who had offered it to me when I told him I needed to get out of the city for a while. It was the kind of offer you say yes to without thinking it through. I pictured a quiet weekend, some reading, maybe some fishing, and coming back feeling lighter. It was late September, 1998. The cabin was in northern Maine, tucked down a half-mile dirt track that branched from a road that barely qualified as a road. The air up there had that sharpness that meant the first frost wasn't far off. It had rained for 2 days before I left, and the dirt road still carried damp patches and a smell of wet leaves. My little Ford barely managed the ruts without bottoming out. The cabin came into view only when I was right on top of it. 1-story, squat, built of weathered pine logs that had gone a dull silver gray. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, but it didn't look unsafe. There was a deck along the front, half covered by a rusted metal awning, and a stack of split firewood leaned against the far wall. No power lines in sight. Inside, it was exactly what I expected and yet a little rougher. 1 room, apart from a tiny bathroom off the side, with a wood stove in the corner, an old metal-framed bed pushed against the wall, a rickety table, and 2 mismatched chairs. A faint smell of old smoke and damp wood hung in the air. Ray had warned me the place didn't have running water in the fall. The pipes were shut off before the freeze, so he'd left a few 5-gallon jugs in the corner. There was also a Coleman lantern, 2 oil lamps, and a box of matches. By the time I'd hauled my bags in, the sun was already sliding toward the tree line. The forest here was thick and close. Dark green pine and spruce, a few yellowed birches scattered in. Sound carried strangely. Sometimes you could hear the faint rush of wind in the treetops, but at ground level it was still and muffled. I lit the lantern and got the stove going. The dry wood caught easily, and soon the cabin had that pleasant heat that sinks into your skin. I fell asleep early, lulled by the crackle of the fire and the steady darkness pressing at the windows. The first night was fine, quiet. No strange noises, nothing unsettling. The second night was when I noticed it. It started with a smell. Around midnight, I woke with a sharp awareness that something was different. The fire had burned low, the room dim, the air was colder, and there was a faint scent. Something like damp earth, but sourer, heavier. I sat up and listened. Nothing. No wind, no insects, no drip from the eaves. Just stillness. I tried to ignore it. Told myself it was some mossy log outside steaming in the cool night air. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I decided to explore. Behind the cabin, the ground sloped upward into a ridge. The trees were denser there, and the soil underfoot was soft and springy with decades of needles. I walked for maybe an hour, not straying far from sight of the cabin, just getting a feel for the place. The forest seemed normal enough, though I noticed a strange quiet in certain spots, as if sound was being swallowed. That afternoon, I chopped some wood from the stack, split kindling, boiled water for coffee on the stove. I was settling into the rhythm of the place. But as evening fell, I noticed the smell again. Faint at first, drifting in with the cool air. It was the same sour, earthy odor from the night before. I stepped outside onto the deck and sniffed the air. It seemed stronger to the left, toward the slope behind the cabin. I told myself it was probably a dead animal somewhere out there in the woods. The smell of rot can carry far in still air. That night, I couldn't sleep as easily. I kept waking, checking the time on my old wind-up watch, listening. Around 2 a.m., there was a sound, a faint crunch of leaves from somewhere behind the cabin. My first thought was deer, maybe a moose, but the steps didn't sound heavy enough for moose. They were spaced oddly, 2 paws, then 2 quick steps, then another pause. I lay frozen, eyes on the black window, until the sound faded. The next morning, I decided I needed to see what was back there. The air was sharp and cold, and my breath came in small clouds as I set off behind the cabin. I followed the slope upward, moving slowly, scanning the ground for tracks. About 50 yards in, the smell hit me hard. It was stronger here, sharp enough to make my stomach turn. I pulled my shirt up over my nose and kept going. I found it in a shallow depression between two moss-covered rocks, a scatter of bones picked mostly clean. The skull was intact, the antlers short. A young deer, probably. Around it, the ground was churned up, the leaves matted down. I crouched and studied the dirt. The impressions didn't look like boot prints, but they weren't quite animal tracks either. They were long and narrow, almost human in shape but shorter, the toes oddly splayed. The hair prickled on my arms. I went back to the cabin, told myself it was just an animal kill and some strange erosion making the tracks look that way. I kept the fire going bright that night, but the noise came again. Around the same time, 2 o'clock or so, the crunch of leaves, the pauses, the faint shift of weight on the deck boards. This time I heard a faint scrape against the wall, near the window. I stayed in bed, barely breathing, until it was gone. The next day was overcast, the light thin and gray. I noticed something I hadn't before. Faint scratches on the wood under the window. They were shallow, uneven, like something had dragged across the grain. I told myself it could have been a branch in the wind last winter, but the angle didn't make sense. By the 4th night, I couldn't relax. Every small creak of the cabin made me tense. I kept the lantern burning low beside the bed. The smell was back, stronger than ever, almost like it was inside the cabin now. My skin felt tight, my heart beat too quick. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again, the slow steps, the scrape against the wall. But this time there was something else. The faintest sound of breathing, just outside the window. I lay there for what felt like hours, my mind spiraling. I thought about making a run for the truck, but the idea of stepping outside into that darkness made my chest seize. Eventually the sound faded, but I didn't sleep again. First light, I packed. I didn't care about the schedule or the days I'd planned. I just wanted out. I hauled my bag to the truck, threw it in the back seat, and got in. The road out was rougher than I remembered. Every rut a jolt in my bones. But I didn't slow down until I hit the paved road 20 miles south. I never told Ray what I'd heard. I just thanked him for the use of the cabin and said it wasn't really my kind of place. I didn't mention the smell or the scratches or the breathing at the window. Sometimes I still think about those tracks in the dirt, how close they were to human, but not quite. And I wonder if whoever or whatever left them is still out there in those pines, waiting for the next person who thinks they just need a quiet weekend away. It was late October of 2019 when I drove up to the old hunting cabin near Black Pine Lake in northern Montana. The air was already sharp, and the road leading up was rougher than I remembered from years ago. My uncle had owned the place since the mid-90s, but after he passed, nobody in the family really came out here anymore. The roof sagged a little, the paint had gone the color of dry bark, and the small porch looked like it would collapse under the wrong kind of step. I wasn't there for nostalgia. I needed to be alone. That month had been bad. My phone was full of messages I didn't want to read. The city had become noise I couldn't stand anymore. I thought if I came out here, no internet, no cell service, no one to bother me, I could get my head straight. The gravel road wound deeper into the woods. Trees pressed in close, their bare branches knitting together overhead, letting only strips of pale sky through. I had to slow the truck down for the last mile because the ground was rutted and washed out from fall rains. The sound of stones popping under my tires was the only thing breaking the stillness. When I finally saw the cabin, I felt that odd pull of memory, recognition mixed with unease. I had been here plenty as a teenager during hunting trips, but seeing it alone, in the gray light of late afternoon, gave it a different weight. The front window was so clouded with dust that it looked opaque. The door had a rusted metal latch instead of a proper lock. And above it all, the pine forest loomed, tall, dark, and still. I parked beside the porch. The silence was heavy enough that I could hear my own breathing. Even the air felt thick, full of the scent of wet earth and the faint sweetness of rotting leaves. Inside, the cabin smelled exactly like it had when I was younger, with smoke soaked into the walls, mixed with something metallic and stale. There were 2 rooms, the main space with a small wood stove, a table and a sagging couch, and then a smaller back room with a cot. A few old cans of food still sat on the shelves, their labels faded to ghost colors. A pack of playing cards lay scattered on the table, as if someone had walked away mid-game years ago. I dropped my bag on the cot, set down the gallon of water I'd brought, and went back out to unload the rest of my supplies. Firewood, a lantern, a couple days' worth of food. As the light drained out of the sky, I built a fire in the stove. The flames took their time catching, and the cabin stayed cold long enough that I could see my breath indoors. By the time I ate, just a can of chili warmed over the stove, the forest outside had gone completely black. The only sound was the soft tick of the fire expanding the metal stove. I didn't have electricity, so I used the lantern, its pale light throwing shaky shadows on the wood walls. That first night was uneventful, but sleep came in fits. Every time I started to drift, some faint sound pulled me back. A creak from the porch, a dull thud outside, the rustle of pine needles shifting in the wind. It wasn't anything I could name as threatening, but the darkness here was heavier than it had been in the city. There were no streetlights, no distant cars, just an ocean of black pressing against the thin walls. The next morning, frost coated the truck windshield. My breath curled into little clouds as I stepped outside. I decided to hike the path down to Black Pine Lake, just to remind myself why people used to love coming here. The trail wound downhill for about a mile, the ground soft with layers of pine needles. The lake was still as glass, with a thin mist hovering over it. No boats, no footprints along the shore, nothing but the faint lap of water and a distant woodpecker tapping somewhere up the ridge. I stayed there longer than I planned, sitting on a log, watching the mist slowly dissolve. When I finally headed back, I noticed something strange about halfway up the trail. Off to the side, in the undergrowth, there was a path, narrow like it had been made by something small moving through repeatedly. I didn't remember it from before. It wound deeper into the trees, away from the main trail. I figured it was just deer, so I left it alone. The day passed quietly. I split some of the firewood, boiled water for coffee, and sat on the porch reading an old paperback I'd found in a drawer. But as the sun dropped lower, the quiet started to feel different. Not peaceful, just tense, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. That night, the noises came back, louder this time. The first was a crunch of leaves, slow, deliberate, just outside the cabin wall near where I slept. I sat up in the cot, my ears straining. The sound stopped, replaced by a soft scraping, like something brushing against the siding. My mouth went dry. I told myself it was wind or an animal, but I stayed awake until the fire died down, listening. At some point, exhaustion pulled me under. The third day was when I started to feel watched. It began with little things, a shape in my peripheral vision on the trail that disappeared when I turned my head. The faint smell of smoke drifting through the trees when I hadn't lit a fire yet. The feeling sharp, sudden, of not being alone, even when there was no one in sight. I thought about leaving, but the stubborn part of me said no. It was just the isolation getting to me. People talk about how peaceful the wilderness is, but they forget how loud your own thoughts become when nothing drowns them out. That afternoon, while chopping wood, I saw it. A movement deep in the trees about 50 yards out. Not an animal, person. I froze, the axe still in my hands. The figure was partly hidden behind a tree, tall, wearing something dark. I blinked and they were gone. No sound of retreating footsteps, no crunch of leaves, just gone. My stomach dropped. The cabin was miles from the nearest house. Nobody should have been there. I didn't sleep much that night. By the fourth day, I was ready to go home. I packed some of my things in the truck, but decided to eat breakfast first. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were in the frost, leading from the tree line straight to the side of the cabin, just under the bedroom window, and then back again. The prints were larger than mine, the tread deep. They hadn't been there yesterday. The knowledge sank into me like a weight. Someone had been standing under my window while I slept. It didn't matter that I had come out here to be alone. I didn't feel alone anymore. I didn't even feel safe. I tossed the rest of my things into the truck bed, got behind the wheel, and turned the key. The truck didn't start. Coughed once, then died. I tried again. Nothing but the click of the ignition. I popped the hood, but I don't know much about engines. Only enough to see that the battery cable had been cut clean through. The realization came slowly, cold as the morning air. Someone had done this on purpose. I went back inside, locked the latch, and sat in the middle of the room with my hunting knife in my lap. Hours passed. No knock at the door, no voice calling out, no sign of movement outside. Just silence, which was somehow worse. By late afternoon, I knew I couldn't stay the night. The sun was already sliding behind the ridge, the shadows stretching long over the clearing. I had two options: wait until whoever was out there decided to come back, or hike the 5 miles down the old service road to where it met the highway. I chose the hike. I kept my knife in one hand and a flashlight in the other, even though it was still light out. Every few steps I checked behind me. My boots crunched on gravel, the sound far too loud in the empty woods. Halfway down, I heard footsteps. Behind me, they matched my pace for several seconds before stopping. When I stopped, the forest went silent again. I didn't wait to see who it was. I ran. By the time I saw the strip of asphalt through the trees, my legs were shaking. A pickup came by within minutes, an older man behind the wheel. I waved him down and told him my truck had broken down. I didn't say anything about the rest. He drove me to the nearest town, 30 miles away. 2 days later, when I returned with a tow truck, the cabin looked exactly the same as I'd left it, except for one thing. On the porch, right in front of the door, was a single boot print in the frost, facing inward, like someone had been waiting for me to come back. It was late September 2016 when I decided to get away from the city for a while. I was 33 then, living in Milwaukee, stuck in a job that felt like it was chewing away at me day after day. I didn't really know where I was going when I started planning the trip. I just knew I wanted somewhere quiet, far from streetlights, traffic noise, and the constant buzz of people talking. Somewhere that didn't have a neighbor 20 feet away. I ended up renting a cabin in northern Wisconsin, about 4 hours north of where I lived. It was just outside a small town called Iron Ford, not far from the Michigan border. I found it on some backwoods vacation rental site. The pictures showed a dark brown log cabin sitting near a thick wall of pine trees. A gravel driveway snaked down from a dirt road, and beyond the cabin there was nothing but woods. No other houses in sight. The owner's description said it was ideal for hunters or people looking for solitude. That last part sold me. The drive up was easy at first. The highway was straight, the sky clear, the leaves just starting to turn. But the farther north I went, the emptier it got. Gas stations got smaller and farther apart. The roads narrowed, and the trees started crowding closer. I stopped once at a faded gas station where the pump still had flip-style numbers. I bought a bottle of water and some trail mix and noticed the cashier staring at me in that way people in small towns sometimes do. Not hostile, just curious. By the time I turned onto the last dirt road, the sun was sinking low and the light had that orange end-of-day look. My GPS lost signal about 2 miles from the cabin, but I had printed directions just in case. I followed them, creeping down a road barely wide enough for 2 cars to pass, with thick brush on both sides. Finally, I saw the gravel drive. It curved sharply and dropped a little before opening to the small clearing where the cabin sat. It was smaller than it looked in the pictures. The logs were darker, weathered, and there were no flowers or decorations, just bare ground around it with a few patches of grass. The roof was tin, dull with age. The place was silent except for the faint ticking of my cooling engine. I got out and stood there for a while, breathing in air that smelled of pine and damp earth. Inside, it was simple. A single room with a bed in one corner, a small table, a wood stove, and a kitchen counter with an old 2-burner stove top. A short hallway led to a bathroom with a shower and toilet. There was no TV, no internet, and barely any phone signal, which was exactly what I wanted. That first night, I sat at the table eating a can of soup I'd heated on the stove. The only sounds were the occasional creak from the wood settling and the distant rustle of leaves outside. It was the kind of quiet that city people aren't used to, deep and heavy, where your own breathing feels loud. When I turned off the single lamp, the cabin went completely dark. The windows were black squares. I could hear the faint hum of insects, and once in a while, something moving in the woods. Probably deer, I told myself. The next morning, I woke to the pale light of sunrise filtering through the trees. I made coffee on the stovetop, stepped outside, and felt the cold bite of early fall air. I spent the day walking the narrow dirt road, exploring small trails that led into the forest. The ground was soft with fallen pine needles, and the air carried the smell of damp wood. I found a small stream about half a mile from the cabin, its water so clear I could see the pebbles on the bottom. By afternoon, clouds had rolled in, and a faint drizzle started. I spent the evening reading an old paperback I'd brought, the sound of rain on the tin roof making the place feel even more isolated. When night came, I noticed it was colder. I lit a small fire in the wood stove, which filled the cabin with the scent of burning oak. On the third night, things started to feel different. I'd been outside just before sunset, chopping some kindling I found stacked beside the cabin. While I was out there, I had the sudden feeling I wasn't alone. It wasn't something I heard, more like a shift in the air, a tightening in my stomach. I glanced toward the treeline. The shadows between the trunks were deep now, the last light fading. I didn't see anything move, but I felt watched. I told myself it was just the stillness playing tricks on me and went inside. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard something outside. Not the random snap of a twig you sometimes hear, but steady footsteps on the gravel drive. Slow, spaced out, crunching in the cold air. I froze, listening. The steps stopped for a while. Then I heard the faint sound of something brushing against the cabin wall, like a coat or bag brushing wood. I sat up, heart pounding, and reached for the flashlight I kept on the floor. When I shone it at the window, all I saw was the pale reflection of my own face. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I walked around the cabin, looking for tracks. The ground was damp enough that footprints would have shown, but I didn't see anything clear, just disturbed pine needles in a few places. I told myself it was an animal. A deer could sound like a person if you weren't thinking straight in the dark. But that night, it happened again. I was lying in bed, almost asleep, when I heard the sound. Soft crunching on the gravel, slow and deliberate. My pulse jumped. The sound circled halfway around the cabin, then stopped. I stayed still, hardly breathing, straining to hear. After a minute or two, there was a faint scrape against the wall again. This time, it was lower down, like something brushing along the base logs. I sat there, staring into the dark, every muscle tight. I didn't go outside. I just waited, listening until the night went silent again. By the fourth day, I started feeling worn down. Every time I stepped outside, I scanned the treeline. The woods felt different now, not peaceful but watchful. Even in daylight, I caught myself glancing over my shoulder. I told myself I was being paranoid, but the feeling wouldn't leave. That afternoon, I decided to check the small trail leading past the cabin deeper into the woods. I walked for about 15 minutes before I noticed something odd. Off to the left, maybe 20 yards in, I saw a tree with bark stripped away in a wide vertical patch. The wood underneath was pale and raw. It didn't look like animal damage. I stepped closer and noticed scuff marks in the dirt near its base. Long, shallow scrapes, like something heavy had been dragged. I went back to the cabin with that image in my head. That night, the footsteps came again, but this time, they stopped directly outside the wall near my bed. I could hear faint shifting, like someone adjusting their weight. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the flashlight. I didn't turn it on. I just stayed frozen, listening until the sound finally moved away. The next morning, I made up my mind to leave. I started packing my things, stuffing clothes into my bag without folding them. I kept glancing at the windows, When I stepped outside to load the car, I saw something that made me stop cold. In the soft patch of dirt beside the cabin, just under the bedroom window, were two clear boot prints. Large, men's boots, pointing toward the wall. I threw the rest of my stuff in the car and drove out without looking back. The whole drive down the dirt road, I kept checking the mirror. The woods on either side looked too still, like they were holding their breath. When I finally reached the highway, I felt my chest loosen. I never reported it. I told myself it wouldn't matter. I hadn't seen a face and I hadn't been harmed. But sometimes, late at night, I think about those prints under the window, and I wonder how many nights that person had been out there, watching without making a sound. I've never liked the woods at night. Even as a kid, I'd get this heavy feeling when the sun dipped below the trees and the shadows thickened. You tell yourself it's just nature, just the wind and the dark. But there's something about being far from people that makes you feel like you don't belong. In October of 2016, I took a trip out to a small cabin on Blackwater Ridge in northern Idaho. I was 33 at the time, single, and working as a graphic designer for a small marketing firm in Boise. I'd been feeling worn down. Late nights, too much coffee, and staring at a computer screen until my eyes hurt. A friend of mine, Eric, had mentioned he knew someone who rented out a small off-grid cabin for cheap. No power except a generator, no cell service, nothing but the woods and a stream nearby. It sounded like exactly what I needed. The drive from Boise to Blackwater Ridge took a little over 6 hours. The last 20 miles were on a narrow dirt road, weaving through pine forest so dense it felt like the trees were leaning in over the road. I remember having to slow to a crawl because of all the ruts and fallen branches. The sun was already low by the time I reached the turnoff for the cabin's access road, a rough track that went uphill for about a mile. When I pulled up, I saw the cabin for the first time. It was small, just a single-story rectangle with a pitched metal roof and a narrow porch. Weathered cedar siding, one small window in the front, and a heavy wooden door. There was a shed off to the side, its door slightly ajar. A pile of split firewood sat under a tarp. The air smelled of pine sap and cold earth. My boots crunched on gravel as I walked around, checking the place out. Behind the cabin, the ground sloped down to a stream about 30 yards away, the water running clear and fast over rocks. Past that, the forest stretched in every direction, dark and endless. Inside, the cabin was basic. One room with a wood stove, a small kitchen counter with a propane burner, a cot against one wall, and a table with 2 chairs. A ladder led up to a small loft under the roof. Everything smelled faintly of old smoke and cedar. There was no cell signal, of course. My phone was basically a useless brick now. I didn't mind, part of me wanted that. The first day was peaceful. I unpacked my gear, stacked some firewood inside, and lit the stove as the temperature started to drop. By the time darkness fell, the cabin was warm and glowing with the flicker of the fire. I sat at the table, ate a can of chili, and listened to the wind moving through the trees outside. I slept well that night, but sometime around dawn, I woke up to a noise. It wasn't loud, but it was different enough from the usual creaks and groans of the cabin to pull me out of sleep. A slow crunching sound, like footsteps in the gravel outside. I lay there, holding my breath, straining to listen. The sound stopped after a few seconds. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon nosing around. Still, I got up and peeked out the front window. The pale light of morning made everything look washed out. Nothing moved. The gravel road was empty. That day I hiked along the ridge, following an old logging road that curved around the hill. The forest was silent except for the occasional call of a bird. The air had that thin, sharp edge that told me snow wasn't far off. I kept seeing little signs of wildlife, tracks in the mud, claw marks on a tree trunk, but I never saw anything bigger than a squirrel. When I got back to the cabin late in the afternoon, I noticed something strange. The shed door, which had been slightly open when I arrived yesterday, was now closed. I didn't remember touching it. Inside the shed, there was nothing unusual. Just an old rusted axe, a coil of rope, and some fishing gear. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been here. That night, I lit the stove again, cooked some pasta, and read by lantern light. Around 11 p.m., as I was dozing off, I heard the crunching sound again. This time it was clearer. Definitely footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving around the cabin. Gravel, then the sound of something brushing against the wooden wall. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. My shotgun was propped against the wall near the door. I hadn't touched it since arriving. I reached for it now, holding it across my lap. The sounds stopped. For a long time, I just sat there in the dark, listening. The fire had burned low, and the shadows seemed deeper. I thought about calling out, but the idea of breaking the silence felt wrong. I waited another 10 minutes before finally convincing myself it was an animal again. When I woke the next morning, there were fresh footprints in the gravel outside. Not boot prints, shoes. Men's size by the look of them. They circled the cabin. The rest of that day, I couldn't focus on anything. I kept looking toward the trees, expecting to see movement. I thought about packing up and leaving, but something in me resisted. Maybe pride, maybe stubbornness. I told myself I was being paranoid. Still, I kept the shotgun loaded and near me all day. That night, I barely slept. Every creak and groan of the cabin set my nerves on edge. At some point, I heard movement again, this time from behind the cabin, near the stream. Something metallic rattled. I didn't move from my bed, but my grip on the shotgun tightened. When I checked in the morning, I found the propane tank by the kitchen wall had been shifted, like someone had tried to move it. There were more footprints in the dirt by the stream, leading into the trees. I decided I was leaving the next day, but that night was the worst. I killed the lantern early, letting the fire burn low so the cabin was mostly dark. I lay in bed, eyes open, listening. Just after midnight, I heard it, the soft crunch of footsteps again, closer this time. Then came the slow, deliberate sound of the front doorknob turning. It rattled once, twice, stopped, then again harder. I sat frozen, shotgun in my hands, my pulse roaring in my ears. Whoever it was didn't knock, didn't say a word, just tried the knob over and over like testing it. Finally, the sound stopped. I waited, barely breathing, until I heard the footsteps retreat into the gravel and fade away. I didn't sleep after that. I sat at the table until dawn, the shotgun across my knees, staring at the door. When the first light came, I packed my gear in under 10 minutes. I loaded everything into the truck, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. The forest was quiet. As I turned the truck around, I saw something nailed to a tree at the edge of the clearing. A scrap of wood, weathered and cracked, with words carved into it in rough letters. "Stay out." I didn't stop to look closer. I drove until I hit pavement, and then I didn't stop again until I was halfway back to Boise. I never found out who had been there those nights. Maybe a local who didn't like strangers. Maybe someone living out in the woods, looking for easy prey. I just know that I've never gone back to Blackwater Ridge, and I never will.